Chapter 397. The misty howler's fur stood on end as it pounced forward. Its huge body covered half of the sky, and it was as if time itself had stopped. Brando smelled the stench of blood and knew that he was close to the beast's fangs. The next moment, his head would be separated from his body. If he was an ordinary gold-ranked warrior, he would be in grave danger. However, Brando was also an elementalist. He turned around in the air and shouted, "Wind, shackles release." A wind dance technique was cast on his body. This wind spell was a cantrip that any elementalist could learn when they started their apprenticeship. Its effect was to slow down the fall. It was an adventurous spell in the game and was not designed to be used in battle. However, the creativity of the players was limitless. Ever since the first elementalist called Death Zone used this spell in actual combat to change the flight path and avoid attacks, this spell had become one of the most popular low-level spells in PvP. This was because Wind Dance was just a cantrip. As long as ones will reach 20 ounces, they could cast this spell without any spells. Although Brando was not an elementalist in the past, he had seen this technique in countless videos. The misty howler calculated the speed of his fall and pounced forward. However, Brando spread his wings and suddenly slowed down in the air. The male wolf roared angrily and brushed past him. Brando rode on countless azure feathers and turned in the air. He pulled the misty howler's silver mane and leaped forward with the beast. It looked like Brando was riding on the back of the male wolf, but it was not so leisurely. The misty howler's reaction was very fast. It immediately noticed that Brando was on its back after its attack failed. Therefore, as soon as its front feet touched the ground, its huge body swept one after another. It actually changed its direction. However, Brando's reaction was not slow either. The male wolf tried to throw Brando off its back, but Brando stabbed his sword near the wolf's spine. The Halran Gaia pierced into the wolf's spine as if it was a layer of rotten leather. An arrow of blood spurted out from the back of the male wolf. Brando could not help but sigh. He had never thought of fighting a monster over level 60, elemental activation, with the strength of a level 40, lower gold. Even if he had the ability at that time, the weapon in his hand would not have been able to penetrate the opponent's defense. Ordinary level 30 to 40 weapons could not even pierce through the tough outer skin of elemental level monsters. Even if it was the same fantasy weapon, it could only break through the defense. However, the additional sharpness and hardness of Halran Gaia made it a powerful weapon against monsters of a higher level. With this sword strike, the outcome would be decided. The misty howl let out a shrill cry, but strangely, its blood turned into mist as soon as it came into contact with the air. Brando quickly held his breath. The blood of monsters was not a good thing, and most of them were highly toxic to humans. However, he immediately let go of the mane and jumped down to the side. An inexperienced warrior might have remained on the back of the mist howler and attacked, but how could a monster with elemental activation be easy to deal with? There was no such thing as a blind spot. Sure enough, as soon as Brando jumped, white gas rose from the mist howler's body and condensed into 4 whips. The whips swept across the male wolf's back one after another. If Brando was still on the back of the male wolf, he would have been smashed to pieces. The male wolf controlled the whips and immediately realized that the enemy had changed positions. The cunning of the human surprised it. At least 3 times, it thought that it had a chance to kill the human in one fell swoop, but each time, the human dodged at the last moment. If it was the first or second time, it could be said to be a coincidence, but if it was the 3rd time, then it could not be said to be a coincidence. The male wolf's IQ was very high, and it immediately jumped back to distance itself from Brando. The man and beast's dazzling exchange of blows only lasted for 2 to 3 seconds before both of them landed on the ground at the same time, and the battle finally came to an end. The people in the distance did not see what happened, and only Quinn and Scarlet understood what had happened. Scarlet was still fine as she didn't know how terrifying a male wolf was, but Quinn's expression changed. As a tree elf who lived in the forest all year round, he knew how powerful the male wolf was. But such a terrifying creature was taken advantage of by the young human in the first round of attacks. Brando's use of skills was simply amazing. It was as if he knew how the Mist Howler would attack and was always able to predict the enemy's moves. Brando indeed knew what the Mist Howler was going to do next. Although every male wolf had a unique name, it was only a legend. In fact, the Mist Howler was a common name for this type of male wolf. A male wolf that mastered the elemental activation of mist. Brando had fought with this type of big guy before and was very familiar with their habits. It was as if the big guy was about to bare its fangs and attack as soon as it landed. It lowered its body and prepared to pounce. Brando also landed on the ground, but he had to regain his balance and could not catch up with the opponent's movements. There was a difference of several tenths of a second. This was a difference of several times the dexterity on the battlefield. Brando immediately activated Tree's toughness, and a layer of horny skin grew all over his body. The black skin looked terrifying. He now had close to 250 MP, which could be converted into 5 points of innate armor. In addition to the 2 points of Crimson Blessing and the 5 points of Fire Shield, he had a total of 12 points. Brando intended to take the attack head-on. That's more than enough. The most dangerous part of the distance is when the three of us jump down from the bridge. The reason why I attacked first is to attract the Howling Fog's attention. I know that I'm the only one who has the confidence to evade the Howling Fog's attack in midair. If it was anyone else, they would be beheaded. And he had indeed done it. Brando stabilized himself and raised Halran Gaia with both hands, ready to take the attack head-on. 10 seconds. As long as this attack succeeded, the outcome of the battle would be decided. But the Mist Howler male did not pounce. Because 2 green shadows descended from the sky and blocked its path. If it was an arrow from a normal person, the beast would have ignored it, but this arrow was different. Brando almost screamed when he saw the arrow. The arrow of life was the bane of all monsters. It was said that this was a holy item from the goddess of the forest and had the power to destroy darkness and chaos. Of course, this was an exaggeration, but it was true that the arrow of life could temporarily suppress a monster's elemental power. In other words, if the arrow hit the Mist Howler male wolf, it would turn into a normal monster at the pinnacle of gold. If the arrow hit the Mist Howler male wolf would not be hit by the arrow. The monsters in the forest and the goddess of the forest were old enemies and knew each other's methods. The moment the green arrow was released, the Mist Howler male wolf instinctively felt threatened and retreated. It avoided Quinn's arrow, but also gave up on attacking Brando. Another 3 seconds passed. It was only then that Scarlet's first attack arrived. As soon as the red-haired girl landed on the ground, she stretched out her left hand towards the Misty Howler. 7th Lightning Cord. She knew that the Misty Howler was powerful, so she used her most powerful skill right away. 5 bolts of lightning shot out from her fingertips. This time, it was much stronger than the one she used against the tree herders in Chablis. The bolts of lightning coiled around her body and shot towards the Mist Howler male wolf like a lightning dragon. Boom! A loud sound rang out. The lightning dragon pierced through the Mist Howler male wolf's body. Arcs of electricity crackled and formed a dazzling white ball of electricity under the night sky. But what surprised her was that the lightning seemed to have hit a cloud of mist. The Mist Howler male wolf's body suddenly dispersed like a real white mist in the air. Scarlet didn't think that she could kill this terrifying creature with an elemental awakening in one blow. She immediately turned around vigilantly, just in time to see the monster reassembling its body from a cloud of mist behind her. A pair of blood-red eyes stared at her. Scarlet almost held her breath. The Mist Howler male wolf raised its claws. Quinn! Brando immediately shouted. The mist howler male wolf was only 60 meters away from him. It was too late for him to attack. Even though Scarlet had the recovery ability of an oracle, she would be bedridden for at least 10 days to half a month after being hit by the mist howler male wolf. Scarlet had learned her lesson from her previous battle with Ekman. Quinn raised his bow and shot 2 more life arrows. The green light forced the mist howler male wolf to retreat again. The monster roared angrily. It was starting to get impatient after its repeated attacks had failed. It let out a low growl from its throat, ordering the surrounding black wolf lords and their pack to attack. This was the 15th second. But Brando had already expected this. This was the reason why he brought Quinn along. But the young lord had changed his mind. He originally wanted Quinn to suppress the surrounding black wolf lords while Scarlet attacked. But now that the tree elf leader had the life arrows, things were different. Scarlet, deal with the surrounding monsters. Brando shouted in a hurry, Quinn, shoot the silver line on the mist howler male wolf's forehead. That's where its magic converges. Monsters were formed by magic power, and the point where their magic power converged was similar to the vital points of ordinary creatures. Quinn was slightly startled. He squinted his eyes and saw a faint silver line on the mist howler male wolf's forehead. The tree elf leader hesitated for a moment before raising his bow. 2 life arrows appeared on the bowstring. At the same time, a circle of lightning struck the surrounding black wolves that were trying to surround them, tearing their skin and flesh apart. Their burnt fur emitted a nauseating burnt smell. Brando circled to the side of the mist howler male wolf. But the mist howler male wolf also turned around. It felt threatened by Quinn's arrows and knew that he was aiming at its weak point. This feeling made it feel uneasy. Uneasiness accompanied by anxiety. Author's note, I'm going to faint. I was supposed to release it at 8 p.m. Luckily, someone came to ask me. I'm in tears again. Chapter 398. Anxiety was often accompanied by anxiety. After the Misty Howler realized that it was unable to shake off Brando despite changing its attack pattern twice, the human seemed to know what it was thinking and would always appear in the path of the Misty Howler. Finally, the Misty Howler could no longer hold back and pounced on Quinn with its mouth full of white teeth. This was the 20th second. But Brando would not let it go. He raised Howlran Gaia and clashed with the Misty Howler's fangs twice, producing an ear-piercing sound of metal clashing against metal. The immense force forced Brando back, and his hands felt as if they were about to break and fly out of his body. When the Misty Howler parried the Misty Howler's fangs for the second time, the Howlran Gaia was bent back by almost 90 degrees. What the F***ck, this power is too ridiculous. Brando frowned. If not for the stability of Howlran Gaia, he would have been dead by now. But it was not much better. The Misty Howler finally lost its patience and leaped back to avoid Brendel's attack. Instead, it pounced on Brendel. It also realized that it would not be able to attack Quinn without killing the human first. Once the Misty Howler changed its target, Brando knew that his good days were over. With the 20-level suppression, he could not even see the Misty Howler's movements clearly. He instinctively blocked the attack with his right hand and felt a sharp pain in his body. Then, he was sent flying. The fire shield that surrounded his body suddenly shattered, and the defense provided by the tree tenacity was also penetrated in an instant. Fortunately, the Crimson Red Blessing was a fantasy-grade equipment, otherwise it would have ended up like his first pair of gloves. Brando was sent flying nearly 20 meters into a pack of Misty Howlers and even landed beside a Misty Howler. He was dizzy from the fall, but fortunately, he remembered that he was still on the battlefield. He quickly shook his head and sat up. But just as he sat up, he squinted his eyes and scanned his surroundings. His vision was dark red from the blood dripping from his forehead. Then, he saw a Misty Howler the size of a horse carriage staring at him. Holy sh*t. In a daze, Brando was not scared half to death by the pair of blood-red eyes. The black wolf seemed to be stunned by this alien as well, but it was obviously much faster than Brando. It was only stunned for a moment before it bit down on Brando's shoulder without hesitation. There was a cracking sound. "Sir Lord!" Scarlet, who was in the distance, screamed in fright. She had just finished off a pack of black wolves and their leader, and when she turned around, she saw Brando being sent flying and killed by the wolves. At that moment, she felt as if the world was falling apart, and she almost blacked out. However, Brando would not die so easily. The red-haired girl immediately saw that although the black wolf had almost swallowed half of Brando's body, a bloody arm rose from between the black wolf's jaws and grabbed half of the monster's head. "A good dog doesn't block the way, understand?" Brando's voice came from the wolf's mouth, and then the hand twisted hard. The crisp sound of bone breaking was heard. The black wolf leader's spine was broken by such a casual twist, and it fell down in a strange posture, revealing Brando, who was sitting on the ground, covered in blood. Brando squinted one of his eyes, and his left eye and face were bleeding. The young lord's expression did not change, but when the black wolf bit half of his shoulder, he almost died from the pain. Brando was really unlucky this time. He did not expect to fall beside a black wolf leader. But when he was sent flying by the misty howl, his HP had already dropped below the limit. At that time, his innate ability had already activated and saved his life. As for the black wolf leader's attack, it was just an additional pain. Other than that, it did not affect him at all. But Brando did not have time to lament how bad his luck was. He immediately looked up at the direction of the misty howl. In his blood-red vision, he saw the misty howl retreating. In fact, Quinn had already readied himself to shoot the moment the youth was sent flying. 25 seconds. Quinn aimed for a moment, released the bowstring, and 2 arrows left the bowstring. But even though he had experienced hundreds of battles, at this moment, the tree elf leader did not dare to believe that his arrows would be effective. The male wolf's reaction was too fast. In an instant, the 2 arrows pierced through the fog like 2 straight green lines and pierced the misty howl's forehead. At this time, the male wolf had just sent Brando flying and was preparing to deal with the tree branch on the rock bridge. But what it saw were 2 green lights. It hit. Quinn shouted in his heart. The life arrow hit the center of the male wolf's forehead, but what made the tree elf leader's expression change was that the male wolf actually turned into mist again, allowing the 2 life arrows to pass through its body and nailed into the ground beside its feet. His wings were still shaking slightly. The attack was ineffective. Quinn could not believe his eyes. He was using the arrow of life that was blessed by the goddess of the forest, Naya. The arrow of life was the bane of all demons. Logically speaking, it should be able to repel all elemental powers. But how did the male wolf manage to dodge it? Quinn did not understand, but that did not mean that Brando did not know. In fact, the misty howl was not feeling as good as he thought. In order to avoid the fatal arrow, it had used its life-saving skill. Brando remembered that the skill was called World Projection of Fog. When the misty howl used this skill, its body no longer existed in this world and it was immune to all physical and magical attacks. Even holy words and magical spells could not affect it. But it was a pity that it could only use this skill once a day. In the game, once the male wolf used this skill, it would go all out. Brando remembered the berserk state very clearly, and he had been waiting for this moment. As expected, after the misty howl paused for a moment, its body suddenly lit up with eye-catching blood-red patterns. This was Mana Burst, a skill that every high-level monster knew. It was similar to the berserker's berserk state, but it did not have any side effects other than consuming a large amount of mana. This was the ultimate skill of the monsters, and they would not use it unless they were in a desperate situation. Once Mana Burst was used, the monster's strength would increase by about 10%, which was about 5 levels. The current Misty Howl was close to level 70 elemental mutation. At this moment, not only Brando, but even Scarlet could feel the terrifying power of the Misty Howl. Quinn, who was in front of the Misty Howl, paled. Then, he saw the Misty Howl open its mouth, and a faint red light appeared in the depths of its throat. The leader of the tree elves instinctively wanted to dodge, but the moment he moved, he realized that the white fog around him was as heavy as a mountain, and he could not move. Then, a ray of red light hit Quinn's chest. The tree elf's longbow fell to the ground and he immediately let out a scream. Misty Curse, Life Evaporation. This was a single target, but its power was so terrifying that any player who participated in the first Calamity of Wolves mission would tremble in fear. Once again, it appeared in front of Brando. Life Evaporation was one of the most terrifying spells in the early stages of the game. Yes, it was a spell, not a skill. It was a type of witchcraft, and also the first instant death spell. Its effect was to evaporate all the liquid in a person's body. For most creatures, this was the gate to heaven that led them straight to death. Ha! But at this moment, Brando could not help but smile proudly. He had been waiting for this moment. Brando raised his left hand, and a blue card appeared in his hand, Energy Drain. Sense. Life Evaporation, Ring of Thunder, Life Ward is within the range of my senses. Ring of Lightning is obviously Scarlet's skill, but this Blessing of Life should be Quinn's spell. Brendel was slightly taken aback. But the creature hit by the fog curse would not be able to move or cast a spell. It seemed that this spell was provided by his equipment. To be able to resist the effect of a level 7 fog curse, the tree elf leader's equipment was not bad. There were all kinds of strange spells provided by equipment, so it was normal that Brando had not heard of them before. But he immediately put down the card in his hand and replied, Target Curse, Life Evaporation. Seized. The green light on his retina changed. At this moment, the fog howler suddenly let out a furious roar because it found that it could not control its own spell. Brando pointed his finger at the fog howler from afar, and the red light spat out by the fog howler made a turn in the air. At that moment, almost everyone on the battlefield saw this scene. They saw the long red light circle in the air and hit the fog howler. A mournful cry was heard. The spell was the first to take effect. Red mist gushed out from the male wolf's body. The giant wolf trembled under the immense pain and fell to the ground. In an instant, the red mist surrounding its body spread to dozens of feet. Hold your breath. Brando covered his bleeding eye with one hand and immediately shouted. He knew that the blood was evaporated and should not be touched. When the fog howler fell to the ground, the spell was immediately interrupted because the guide had lost consciousness. But the spell's interruption did not mean that the disaster was over. The forceful interruption of the spell caused the magic to backfire and take over the tattered corpse. Followed by a loud noise, the male wolf that fell on the ground suddenly exploded from the inside, turning into a pile of white, rotten meat. Even so, the flowing magic still flowed through the broken organs, and the large and small explosions lasted for a few seconds before stopping. Brendel finally relaxed when he saw this tragic scene. The young lord sat on the ground covered in blood and let out a long sigh of relief, but he could not move his eyes away from Brendel's sight. Brando was stunned as he looked at the pile of flesh that represented the fog howler's corpse. Looking at the black spindle-shaped feldspar, he could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. No way, the heart of Ekis the Calamity. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 400. Mist lingered in the mountains. After the battle, there was a strange tranquility in the forest. Hundreds of centaurs were scattered in the forest, taking a short rest after the battle. Not far away, the young men from Erewhon were almost all injured, and the tree elves were not much better. After killing thousands of wolves to open a bloody path, everyone felt a kind of exhaustion from the depths of their bones. This kind of exhaustion was like a pair of dying claws grabbing at your nerves, dragging you into the abyss of drowsiness. But even if their eyelids were fighting, no one dared not to be alert. Brendel sat on a withered tree that had fallen to the ground. He did not know which era the tree was from, but the hollow trunk was covered with layers of moss, and there was even a bunch of mushrooms growing under it. He held his injured cheek with one hand, and even though it was painful, he gritted his teeth and allowed Maria to cast a healing prayer on him. Fortunately, the healing spell was as powerful as in the game. Brando felt a slight itch on his wound, but it quickly healed and the pain disappeared. But the excessive blood loss still caused the fatigue. The healing spell could accelerate the metabolism, but it could not produce energy out of thin air. After casting the last spell, Muriel took out a small piece of dry food from her bag and handed it to him. "Eat something, Mr. Baron. It will make you feel better." Her voice was a little soft, but it was very pleasant to hear. "Have you been on the battlefield?" Brando asked. "As a cleric, I participated in the night's operation." Muriel replied with her head lowered. "Cleaning up bandits?" Muriel nodded. "Have you seen a dead person?" "Yes." "No wonder." Brando secretly sighed that he had picked up a treasure. An experienced cleric who did not have a position in the temple was very rare among the NPCs. It was just that Muriel did not seem to have any sense of belonging to the group. He vaguely felt that this trainee cleric was knowledgeable, and most knowledgeable people had their own opinions, and it was much harder to fool them than the average person. But did this knowledge come from books, or did it come from personal experience? Brando asked, "Do you like that guy?" Just as he finished speaking, he heard a series of coughs coming from behind him. Brando didn't need to turn around to know who it was. But Muriel also blushed. She lowered her head and did not answer. Brando smiled. "Although you didn't answer, I already have an answer." As long as he had Carglass in his grasp, he wouldn't have to worry about the priestess staying behind. At the same time, he also confirmed Maria's gender. Amandina sat beside Brando and couldn't help but chuckle. Brando's thoughts couldn't escape her mind, but she couldn't help but laugh at his blunt question. "Since Sir Lord isn't good at these things, why don't you just let me do it?" The noble lady couldn't help but think. "My lord, when do we depart?" Carglass noticed the strange atmosphere, and Maria's blushing face made him a little uncomfortable. He coughed and hurriedly stepped forward to interrupt. "Depart?" Brando was a little amused. He put down his hand, and there was a light white scar on his left cheek. The color was different from the rest of his skin. What's the hurry? When the Black Wolf Lord bit him, its fangs were like daggers that cut across his cheek, leaving a long wound. The wound extended from his forehead to his cheek. Fortunately, it was blocked by the frontal bone, or else according to Maria, he would have lost his left eye. Brando was scolded by Amandina because of this, but she knew that Brando had no choice but to let it go. Ahem, Carglass coughed again. He knew Brando's plan. "Of course I'm in a hurry. Didn't my lord say that we only have a few hours left?" Even though they had only known each other for less than a month, Carglass had gradually become familiar with his lord's personality. To be honest, if it wasn't for the fact that he liked to criticize Erwin, Brando would have been the best follower in his mind. "That's true," Brando replied, "but there's no need to hurry. Everyone needs to rest." He raised his eyes and looked at Carglass. "Are you feeling guilty?" Carglass coughed heavily and decided not to answer. Brendel smiled and took out a pitch-black, spindle-shaped stone from his backpack. The previous battle could be considered tragic. He had lost 4 of his youths, and it was the first time they had suffered such a loss since they entered the dark forest. Other than those who died, there were also some who were seriously injured. It could be said that 10% of the youths that Brando personally trained had lost their ability to fight on the battlefield, and this was even under the protection of the centaurs and tree elves. However, he was satisfied that the death of their companions did not defeat the youths. Although it was inevitable that their morale was low, at least they did not despair or break down. This meant that they were already qualified warriors. Brando believed that the youths under his command would become excellent seedlings after more training and tempering. Although they might not be as good as the players of the past, they would at least be able to step into the current era. Under his guidance as a player, some of these youths might be injured or die, but no matter what, they would become the first batch of beneficiaries of the Great Demonic Wave. This was a treatment that only the brightest geniuses in history could enjoy. Thinking of this, he could not help but subconsciously turn around. The injured centaurs were resting in the forest. They had suffered the most losses in this battle. According to the centaur elder Wird, at least a third of the centaurs had left the battle. Most of them were dragged into the dark wolf tide and torn to pieces. Of course, the tree elves and druids had also suffered some losses, but it was not as bad as the centaurs. Now, he only had about 400 centaur elder guards left. They were intermediate silver-ranked warriors. Then there were more than 200 tree elf archers. To be honest, as a lower silver-ranked ranged unit, Brando was reluctant to send the tree elf army into a war of attrition. He imagined for a long time what would happen if he sent the tree elves to Tonagel's battlefield. But it was a pity that most of these tree elves were destined to fall in this forest tonight. Lastly, there were the dozens of youths under his command, and the dozen or so silver-ranked knight in Erwin's diplomatic party. However, it was unlikely that Count Audine would give him command of the knight, so Brando automatically ignored them. He glanced at the nobles. Audine and Dolent were fine in the previous battle, but the noble female scholar had died on the battlefield. Brando could not help but sigh. He had saved the female scholar's life because she was Scholar Anthony. Unfortunately, he could only save her once, but in the end, he could not save her a second time. This made him sigh. Although the casualties were heavy, the result was still glorious. In the eyes of almost everyone except for Brando, killing a male wolf was already an impossible task. The ability that the male wolf displayed at the end showed its rank. Elemental activation. Those who were slightly knowledgeable understood what it meant. Brando, Quinier, and Scarlet were only lower gold ranked, but they were able to kill it. Of course, the main credit for this was Brando. Everyone saw the last scene. Brando's attack that changed the direction of the Misty Howler's spell confirmed his identity as a master of curses and swords. In addition to the male wolf, there were more than 3 black wolf lords and countless black wolves that died under Brando's sword at the beginning of the battle. The wolf tide within a radius of 1,000 square meters was swept twice in a row. Brando did not notice it at the time, but after the battle, he was shocked by the increase in experience points. Other than the 35,000 experience points from killing the Misty Howler, the experience points from killing the Black Wolves and Black Wolf Lords was as high as 23,250. That one attack gave him almost 60,000 experience points, and after that, he gained almost 12,000 experience points from fighting in Party Mode or Army Mode. This battle alone gave Brando more than 70,000 experience points. Brando calculated this number, which meant that they had killed at least 10,000 black wolves. The only regret was that the number of black wolves was too large, and the drops from the Black Wolf Lords were all wasted. Thinking of this, Brando looked at the cold stone shuttle in his hand. Fortunately, he had obtained this item. Just this one item alone was worth the price of the ticket. What is this? Scarlet, who was sitting at the side and leaning on the lightning spear, looked at Brando holding the item in his hand without saying a word. She held back her curiosity, but she was not as good as Amandina. She finally could not help but reveal her small canine teeth and ask. Brando looked up and smiled mysteriously. You mean this? This is something good. My lord, don't keep me in suspense. Carglass could not help but roll his eyes. Hurry up and tell me, I want to know what this is too. It looks like it's worth a lot of money. Worth a lot of money. This time, it was Brando's turn to roll his eyes. Young man, you should know that this item is a divine item that cannot be bought even if you have money. Countless guilds would go crazy for it. You should know that it is not as simple as just money. But in other words, it is unlikely that Carglass knows what money is. He replied, this is Hattie's Heart of Calamity. Ekis Heart of Calamity. The Alpha Wolf Ekis. Amandina asked. Ah, something like that. But this is not Ekis Heart. It is a rare magic item. Legend has it that it seals the soul of a male wolf and imprisons the violent mana and chaos. Mana and chaos? Carglass asked in confusion. Brando nodded and looked at the long stone shuttle in his hand. This thing is the source and core of the male wolf's power. Or rather, it is a male wolf. The one who owns this stone shuttle is the alpha wolf. What does it do? Carglass asked again. You will see soon. Brando answered. The Heart of Calamity was a talisman, but its usage was different from ordinary talismans. As for how to use it, he raised his hand and placed the stone shuttle flat on his forehead. Everyone watched as the stone shuttle in his hand suddenly vibrated and emitted a red light. Then, it softened and strangely melted into Brando's forehead. The stone shuttle went deeper and deeper into his skin. The red light seeped into his skin and spread out like a pattern. Then, it formed a circle of abstract thorn-like patterns on his forehead. Then, the red light slowly faded, and the color of the patterns gradually turned gray. The whole process lasted for more than 10 minutes before it finally subsided. Brando raised his head. The stone shuttle had turned dark red, and under the circle of patterns, it displayed a strange beauty. That grayish-white scar extended from his forehead to his cheek, diluting the bewitching aura once again. The combination of the two made everyone unable to take their eyes off him for a moment. So, Brando raised his head and answered, "It's considered done." Ha! Everyone was stunned. Amandina was even more stunned. She looked at Brando's strange appearance and was speechless for a moment. As soon as Brando's voice fell, he saw a green web of light weave a series of information on his retina. It seemed to be made up of countless words. The green dots then reformed into words: Nest Lord system found, neural connection, connection complete. Willpower passed, obtained, Alpha Wolf status. The green light flashed, and Brando immediately sensed many familiar auras in the surrounding forest. The furthest one was still a few miles away, and it was the scattered wolves that they had shaken off. With a thought, he immediately sent out a message to one of them. In a moment, the tyrannical aura began to move towards their direction. Peak silver rank, agility is at least 100 ounces. Its movement speed is very fast, and it will reach this place in a few minutes. It's a mature black wolf lord. Brando immediately concluded. Everyone looked at him, but he did not say a word. Not far away, Quinn suddenly stood up from the bushes and looked at the side of the forest vigilantly. He immediately signaled to the others. The black wolf has caught up. Everyone's expression changed, and they immediately looked at Brando. This young lord had previously promised that he had shaken off the black wolf. But Brando's expression did not change, and he only looked in that direction. A moment later, accompanied by a loud crash, a huge black wolf lord leaped out from the bushes and landed heavily on the ground. Its body was almost the size of a carriage, and when it landed, the ground shook slightly, but it did not immediately attack. Instead, it raised its head and looked at Brando with its blood-red eyes. Scarlet, who was beside Brando, immediately drew her spear and wanted to stop it. The tree elf leader, Quinn, also raised his bow and aimed at the black wolf lord. If Brando did not raise his hand to signal them to stop, he would have done so. Then he raised his head and looked into the Black Wolf Lord's eyes. The latter hesitated for a moment, and finally slowly approached. But it did not take any offensive actions, and instead stopped not far from Brando. Then it used its huge head to sniff Brando. Then it intimately rubbed against him. At that moment, everyone was stunned. Carglass was the first to react. This is the function of this thing. If he did not see it with his own eyes, he would not have believed it. Brando reached out his hand and touched the Black Wolf Lord's furry nose. He then turned around and smiled proudly. Why, do you think there's a problem? No. No. That's not it. Carglass' eyes suddenly lit up. My lord, how many wolves can you control? Brando thought for a moment. The system recognizes me as a small wolf pack, and I can only control 2 lords and 200 black wolves. But this thing has growth potential, so it's called a divine artifact. The system. Carglass was stunned. Ahem, it's just a name. Only then did Brendel realize that he seemed to have gotten a little carried away, but it was not his fault. Hattie's Heart of Calamity was really too demonic. In the early stages of the game, as long as one player had it, it was simply a power that could sweep through everything. However, it was unlikely for one player to obtain it. Most of the time, it was owned by the large guilds. This was because it would attract too much attention if one player had it. After all, it was a guaranteed drop in the game when a character died. Moreover, it was embedded in the forehead, attracting attention. He remembered that the first Akas's Heart of Calamity was also dropped during the Wolf Tide. Could it be a drop from the Howling Mist? Brendel's heart skipped a beat. Could it really be possible? Did this mean that this thing was a fixed drop? He could not help but scratch his head. At first, he thought that he had been infected by Falerne, and that his bad luck in the game had finally been broken. But now, it seemed that it was not the case. But if the Howling Mist was a fixed drop, then it meant that the other male wolves were the same. Or perhaps, this was the setting of the monster tide. Brando could not help but recall the good things that had been dropped during the Wolf Tide. Other than Ekas's Heart of Calamity, there seemed to be a Claw of Awakening and a Talisman of the Fanged Mythical Beast. Brando was a little tempted, but he knew very well that he did not have the ability to reap more benefits from the Wolf Tide. If he was a step late, he might even end up in the belly of the wolves. Therefore, he could only resist the urge to pry into the legendary equipment. One must be content with what one has. Brando comforted himself. After all, it was already a surprise that he had obtained Ekas's Heart of Calamity. The Heart of Calamity, the Claw of Awakening. The Talisman of the Talisman of the Talisman of the Fanged Mythical Beast was the best one. And more importantly, he was the only player here, so there would not be any player guilds that would come looking for trouble with him. Moreover, the so-called drop upon death was not a punishing attribute to him, was it? Brando was very pleased. Ekas's Heart of Calamity was something that he did not even dare to think about in the game. In fact, he had never paid attention to it. At most, he only knew of its name. He had struck it rich this time. P.S. My body is a little better today. I wanted to rest for a day, but I felt more energetic tonight. So I tried to write a chapter, and it ended up being 5,000 words. Let's post it together. I'll stop at 5,000 words for today. I'll resume my normal update tomorrow. Also, I've been browsing the forums for the past 2 days. In short, I've seen some very funny news. The National Development and Reform Commission has shown its might again, and America has lost its virginity to Afghanistan. The maid nation is acting cute, and Little White Rabbit is secretly attacking. To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 401. Brando lowered his hand from the Black Wolf Overlord's head. In order to form a new wolf pack, it was necessary to subdue the alpha wolf and gather the normal wolves. The Black Wolf Overlord could be subdued through the pressure of the wolf pack leader, but the normal wolves had to be reproduced through the Nest Overlord's ability. In a Black Wolf pack, the male wolf was the core of the Nest Overlord. It guided the gathering of mana to form the Black Wolf, a shadow creature. Now that Brando had inherited the title of the wolf pack leader, he could naturally use Ekka's Heart of Disaster to display this ability. He switched windows in his vision, and the light green screen switched page by page. Finally, he found the new skill in the newly opened LoveLore panel. Nest Overlord, Black Wolf consume 50 points of MP to create a Black Wolf. Nest Overlord, Shadow Rock Beast consume 20 points of MP to create a Shadow Rock Beast. Brando was stunned when he saw the two skills. Summoning the Black Wolf was easy, but what was the Shadow Rock Beast? Could it be that Ekka's Heart of Disaster could provide two types of Black Wolves for the player to choose from? To be honest, Brando didn't know much about this thing. He only knew that it could summon Black Wolves, but this was his first time experimenting with it. He tried to recall, but he didn't remember there being a Shadow Rock Beast among the Black Wolves. Moreover, since it was the Heart of Disaster of the Fog Howl, even if it provided additional variants, it should be the Limp Walker, right? From the MP consumption, this Shadow Rock Beast should be much weaker than the Black Wolves. This was something he couldn't figure out. But since he couldn't figure it out, he might as well give it a try. Although Brando had consumed a lot of spirit, MP, to summon the wind spirit spiders, he had recovered most of it. Summoning a few Black Wolves wouldn't be a problem. He didn't waste any time. He raised Halran Gaia and pointed it at an empty patch of grass not far away. Something seemed to have appeared in the air, and streams of flowing black light gathered there. Finally, with a flash of light, a Black Wolf jumped out of the black magic vortex and landed firmly on the ground. When Brando saw the Black Wolf, he almost dropped the Halran Gaia. Damn, what's going on? He looked at the creature with surprise. It was almost the size of a small pony and stood firmly on the ground with its four limbs stretched out. It had pitch-black fur, a pair of blood-red eyes, and white fangs. It looked like a Black Wolf in every aspect. Other than the thick layer of armor covering its head, neck, shoulders, back, thighs and the backs of its four paws, the strange gray armor was like a layer of armor covering the Black Wolf's body. It looked majestic from afar. Brando didn't remember the Black Wolf being like this. He thought that it was more like a pack of wolves, the male wolf's personal guards, the brutes. Unfortunately, he could clearly see that the luster of the Black Wolf's armor was clearly a layer of rock, not a cuticle or a bone plate. This ecology is a semi-elemental creature. How could this be? Brando was a little puzzled, but Carglass was even more puzzled than him. Did my lord summon it? He had a look of interest on his face. Is it a Black Wolf? Amandina and Scarlet didn't say anything. They were already used to Brendel's strange knowledge. First, it had to be related to the Black Tower wizards. Second, it was a secret. Amandina was very clear that she shouldn't ask too many questions. Fortunately, she had such a temperament, otherwise most people wouldn't be able to resist. The red-haired girl was more straightforward. In her opinion, as long as Brendel did something, it was right. As for the reason, Brendel was right. As for the reason, it was just some unimportant things. However, Maria was a little puzzled and asked, Mr. Baron just fused that strange stone into his body, is it okay? Amandina shook her head, actually, I think it's pretty good. Besides, aren't all wizards like this? Amandina looked at the substitute priestess and replied, my lord knows what he's doing. At this time, Brando didn't have the heart to understand what his subordinates were thinking. He even ignored Carglass's question. He wasn't familiar with Ekka's Heart of Calamity, so he wasn't sure if the black wolf summoned by the Heart of Calamity looked like this. Perhaps it was possible. Brando stood there and thought for a while. He decided to try another skill first. Rock Shadow Beast. He pointed Halran Gaia at the black wolf's side. 20 mana points were lost. Mana converged once more, and this time, all of the black mana flowed towards the ground. The ground suddenly arched, and then a strange creature broke out from the ground. Holy shit, this isn't holy shit. Brando waited for the creature to come to a stop. When he saw the creature's appearance, his jaw almost dropped to the ground. It wasn't just him. Even the people around him were stunned. Carglass even shouted in a low voice, "Aw, isn't that a rock panther?" The youth blurted out. It was indeed a rock panther, but it was different from other rock panthers. Its gray body was streamlined with rocks. Other than its appearance being almost identical to the original rock panther, this strange creature was formed by flowing black mana and floating sharp rocks. The mana formed its torso, and the floating sharp rocks formed the outline of its body, limbs, and head. Brando swore that he had never seen such a creature before. It looked like a demon spawn, a creature formed purely from distorted mana, but it had some characteristics of an elemental creature. What the hell is this? Brando calmed down after being shocked. He immediately thought of his Halran Gaia, and immediately raised it to scan it. With this scan, Brando found the problem. Halran Gaia's stone lair attribute had disappeared from the sword. If it was any other time, Brando would have cursed out loud if one of the most important attributes on his equipment had suddenly disappeared. But now, he understood that the attribute on Halran Gaia did not disappear. Rather, it was better to say that it was merged with Ekka's Heart of Calamity. But does Ekka's Heart of Calamity have this function? This puzzled Brando for a moment. In his original impression, the Heart of Calamity was just a protective amulet with the attribute of the wolf's lair. Perhaps it was special and could only be used after being merged with the body, but Brando thought that it was because the amulet had a special attribute that allowed it to grow. But now, he realized that it might not be so simple. Thinking about it, Brando suddenly realized that equipment rarely provided a special system to the player. Just like the few special systems he knew of in the game, the Elementalist's elemental pool system was opened by the profession. The Lord system was opened by the identity and territory of the player. The elite and leader system of the monster were brought by the template. After that, there was the guild and party system, which need not be explained. There was also the planeswalker system brought by the cards of fate. In other words, Ekka's Heart of Calamity was at least a product of this level. So, the so-called lair system's ability was to gather all the attributes of the player that had the lair ability, turning it into an ability of the player and not an external ability. Brando could vaguely guess how this system worked, but he was curious whether this ability could absorb a fixed lair. If it could, then it would be too overpowered. As long as he searched for lair all over the world, then defeated the guardian of the lair, and absorbed the lair one by one, wouldn't he eventually become an existence like the mother nest? Of course, Brando knew that this was just a thought. If it was really possible, then there should have been a few overpowered players who could summon an army of thousands. But the truth was that there wasn't. Brando thought it through. He even thought of another possibility, which was that the lair master system brought by Ekka's Heart of Calamity was something that didn't exist in the game. This was the same as his planeswalker system. The two were very similar. They were both special systems, and they were both brought by a piece of equipment. Brando looked at the shadow rock beast, then at the black wolf covered in rock armor. His heart suddenly beat violently. He thought of a possibility. Since the black wolf's shadow lair's shadow attribute could affect the rock leopard, then on the other hand, could the rock lair's rock attribute also affect the black wolf? At the very least, what he saw before him was enough to prove this point. This meant that the lair master system provided by Ekka's Heart of Calamity to absorb the attributes of the lair was actually to separate the lair for absorption, and then combine them in the entire system. Brando immediately switched to the information panel of the lair master system. The green web of light changed in his eyes, and his pupils suddenly shrank. Lair master acquired 2 attributes: secondary shadow, secondary rock. Acquired 2 layers, shadow layer, rock layer. Damn! Brando almost jumped up in excitement. It was true. The lair master system separated the attributes of the lair and absorbed them, then combined them and fused them into different lair characteristics to form a new creature. The only thing he didn't know was if the new creature only obtained the characteristics, or if it became stronger because of the new characteristics. If it was the latter, then not only would he have profited greatly, he would have profited greatly. Brando immediately gave it a try. He immediately asked Carglass to test the strength of the 2 monsters. Carglass didn't hesitate, or rather, he wanted to test what the 2 monsters were. In his opinion, the 2 monsters were summoned by Brando, and it wasn't the first time they fought against the rock leopard summoned by Brando. As long as he treated the black wolf as a rock leopard, there wouldn't be a problem. When Carglass unsheathed his sword, Brando immediately ordered the shadow rock monster to attack. Telepathy was a unique ability of the lair master, but it wasn't as good as the ability of a planeswalker to communicate with his summoned creatures regardless of distance. As a lair master, Brando's telepathy range was about 3 to 4 miles. Any further and the effect would be greatly reduced. Upon receiving his order, the shadow rock monster immediately attacked. Its attack style was similar to that of the rock leopard, but there was a black shadow behind it. Carglass was extremely nervous at first, but when he saw the shadow rock monster move, he couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. In the past month, he had fought against the rock leopard countless times, and he was very familiar with its attack style. He thought that even if the shadow rock monster was much stronger than the rock leopard, it wouldn't be too much of a problem as long as he was careful. Carglass took a step forward, raised his sword, and used Erwin's military swordsmanship to test the shadow rock monster. However, it would have been fine if he hadn't probed, but once he did, he couldn't help but be shocked. Carglass thrust his sword forward, but the shadowy rock beast did not even try to dodge the attack. Carglass did not expect the shadowy rock beast to be so violent as to allow the shadowy rock beast to pass through his sword. In the next moment, everyone saw Carglass being pushed to the ground. PS. 2 Update. You know what I mean. From tomorrow onwards, the original update time will be restored. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.cheatyin.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 402. In the next moment, Carglass was pushed to the ground. However, the shadow rock beast did not make any further moves. Instead, it raised its head and looked at Brando. Brando nodded, and the shadow rock beast immediately took a step back. It's close to intermediate iron rank. Carglass rubbed his chest and said, "Is it really that strong?" "This thing is almost as strong as your obsidian panther, my lord." Brando nodded. He was very satisfied with the shadow rock beast. It was close to intermediate iron rank, and more importantly, it had the ability of a semi-transparent creature. A semi-transparent creature could reduce physical damage by half, which meant that its HP was doubled. Moreover, it was much more agile than a real creature. Therefore, the shadow rock beast's strength was at most intermediate iron rank, but its combat strength was far beyond the obsidian panther. He then looked at the black wolf. The black wolf was already at the peak of iron rank, and was on par with Carglass. After its rock attribute was strengthened, it should be even stronger. Brando chose Coden as his test target this time. Needless to say, the black wolf was defeated. However, during the battle, the Shadow Rock Beast's strength was slightly higher than that of a lower silver rank. At the same time, the Black Wolf's new form also had extremely high defense. Coden's attack could not penetrate the rock deck, which meant that the Black Wolf's defense was at least upper silver rank. All in all, the Black Wolf's combat strength was close to that of an intermediate silver rank. Intermediate silver rank. Its strength was almost 2 ranks higher than its original strength. Brando could not help but squint his eyes when he considered the Black Wolf's large population and its potential for growth. Once the Shadow Rock Beast reached intermediate silver rank, it would be able to produce lore-tier monsters, such as the Black Wolf lore-tier and the Obsidian Panther. What kind of monster would it be? Brando's mind was filled with thoughts. While he was very satisfied with the Black Wolf, he also realized that the Black Wolf was obviously very different from its original kind. If that was the case, it would not be appropriate to call it a Black Wolf. Moreover, it would cause confusion. What name should he give it? He turned around, and Carglass, who was still clutching his chest, asked curiously, "My lord, is this thing still a Black Wolf?" "No, I haven't thought of a name for it yet," Brando said honestly. "Let's call it Direwolf then." "It does look like one," Carglass replied. "I think it's more like a warg." Coden obviously disagreed with him. "No." Brando shook his head. He thought for a moment and replied, "I've decided to call it the Garuru Rock Beast." Garuru Rock Beast. Everyone was stunned. What the hell was that? However, Brando's plan was to create a steel nest in the future and turn this thing into a steel Garuru. That would be truly awesome. While he was daydreaming, he suddenly heard footsteps behind him. He was startled. Did Wade come to inform him that they were ready to leave? Brando immediately snapped out of his daze. He was still in the Calamity of Wolves storyline in the Dark Forest. It was far from time to celebrate. At least the formation of a beast horde was not done in a day or two. Furthermore, leveling up required a large amount of materials. The nest was a money-burning machine in the game, and it was the same here. The stone lair only lacked the sage slate, while the investment in the shadows lair had only just begun. But with such thoughts in mind, Brando turned around and was surprised to see that it was not Wade or Quinn, but Count Audine with a gloomy face. Count Audine. He was slightly stunned. Erwin and the others had been following them from afar ever since they failed to persuade him. They did not mention anything about returning, nor did they talk to him. It was as if he was a free bodyguard. But what was going on now? "Baron," Count Audine said, "have you seen Miss Vahina and the others?" Vahina. Brendel paused for a moment before he remembered that it was the name of the noble lady from Kurlutz. But speaking of which, he did not pay attention to the whereabouts of the 3 youths from Kurlutz ever since the battle with the Fog Howler. He did not like the Kurlutz Empire in the first place, and the reason he did not chase them out was because he could not bring himself to do such a thing. He thought that if it were some of the hot-tempered members of his original group here, they might have mercilessly chased them out. The hatred of the Aween players towards the Kurlutz Empire was from the bottom of their hearts. So when Count Audine spoke, Brando was stunned for a moment. He looked around without much concern. "Aren't they here?" "No." Count Audine shook his head. "We have been looking for them for a long time, but we did not see Miss Vahina and Viscount Elman anywhere." "Not here." Brando was puzzled. Shouldn't that bad-tempered girl be with them all the time? Carglass, Muriel, Amandina, Coden, and Scarlet shook their heads in response to his questioning gaze. No one knows. Brando was puzzled. He decided to look for Ropar. The Lizard Man Lord and his subordinates had been guarding the perimeter of the party ever since they entered the Dark Forest. If there was any movement in the perimeter, Ropar would be the first to know. But unfortunately, Ropar's answer was negative. This meant that Elman and the others did not leave the camp ever since they stopped to rest. Otherwise, Ropar and his Fireclaw lizard men would have noticed them. But there was another possibility. That was, Vahina and the others had gone missing before that. But that would be really fun. Of course, Brendel was not concerned about whether they would get lost or not, but he felt that it was a little inconceivable that a few living people would actually lose their way with the team. No matter how useless the young lady was, Viscount Elman and the young alchemist beside her didn't seem like useless people, right? In the end, he went to look for Falerne, who was the most cautious among the wild elves. He wanted to see if the elder wild elf sister could find any clues. But he did not expect Falerne to bring them even more shocking news. She had been looking for her sister all this time. Dia was missing. Brando's first reaction was that it was impossible. Dia was a member of the 12 Lopez mercenaries. She was one of his summoned creatures. There was a telepathic connection between the two of them. It was impossible for his summoned creature to go missing without him knowing. But he immediately sensed Dia's location in his mind. His expression changed when he sensed it. The telepathic connection that even the dark forest could not block had failed for the first time. Martha above, what kind of script was this? At the same time, the bad-tempered noblewoman and her two companions were stumbling through the thorny forest. She almost tripped on the branches that grew out of the ground several times. Even though she managed to maintain her image with the help of the black-haired young alchemist, her beautiful dress was already in tatters. She lowered her head and looked at her beggar-like attire. She could not help but feel angry. Of course, she blamed it on Brando. If not for that country bumpkin, they would not have been forced to come here. When the fog howl created the fog, that guy did not even notice that they were lost in it. That guy is so powerful, he must have done it on purpose. Vahina cursed in her heart. If Brando was in front of her right now, she would have stabbed him with her sword. Unfortunately, Brando was not in front of her right now. Even if he was, she did not have the ability to do so. After grinding her teeth for a while, she could not help but ask, Viscount Elman, how much longer? Didn't you say that we would catch up in a while? She asked weakly. This was not the first time she asked this question. Elman was also a little helpless. He glanced at Rono and thought that this was a good time to strike, but he was not in the mood to do so. He clearly remembered that Brando and his companions went in this direction. There was no reason that they could not catch up to them after such a long time. He knew very well that Erwin and his men would stop to rest. Otherwise, he would not have chosen to chase after them. It was not that he did not think of going back and finding a way to meet up with Veronica, but he did not have the courage to kill his way out of the wolf tide. Hence, the Viscount shrugged and tried to convince himself, I think they are planning to go further away before resting. After all, this place is not far from the wolf tide. It is still too dangerous. His expression changed when he thought of the endless wolf tide. He never thought that the dark forest would be so dangerous. If he had known, he would not have agreed to this mission. He thought that nothing would go wrong with the Empire's god of war, Veronica. But in the end, he did not consider that the young lady beside him was too capricious. But you have said that a few times already. Vahina was a little dissatisfied, I can't walk anymore. Elman could not help but feel a little dissatisfied as well. He took a deep breath and said, you should ask the young lady behind us. Didn't she say that she could contact Erwin? Vahina was stunned. She could not help but turn around to look at Tia, who was struggling to keep up with them. She remembered that the young lady was one of Erwin's people. She also told them that she had a way to contact Brando, but unfortunately, she had not succeeded even once. Communication spells in the dark forest are disrupted by the mana turbulence, Rono replied, it is normal to fail. If we did not have the quartz block, we would not be able to contact the outside of the dark forest either. But the quartz block is a fantasy. Not everyone can get their hands on it. If that is the case, Elman replied with a little dissatisfaction, we should leave her behind. Bringing a little girl along will only slow us down. Viscount Elman, Vahina frowned. As an imperial noble, how can you say something like that? Are you going to leave a child behind? Elman was stunned. He looked at the young lady and then at Rono. Both of them looked dissatisfied. Elman was stunned and quickly corrected himself, my apologies, I lost my composure. Just as Vahina was about to say something, a voice suddenly rang out from the forest and interrupted her words. Ha, you little brats. You still have the heart to argue even in the face of death. Interesting. The abrupt voice reverberated through the forest, causing the surroundings to fall silent. P.S. Please give me some recommendation votes. Recommendations are too ugly, students. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 403. Viscount Elman was the first to draw his sword and pointed it in the direction of the sound. Who's there? He raised his right eyebrow and asked cautiously. Ha ha ha. Elman was answered by a series of light laughter. The laughter came from not far away, and he saw a woman slowly walking out of an ancient oak tree. She had a pair of pointy ears, and her hands were behind her head. She swayed her upper body, and her wavy purple hair cascaded down her back like a waterfall. The woman had a pair of light purple eyes. Her eyeshadow was slightly long, giving her an enchanting vibe. She had a beautiful oval face and purple lips. At first glance, she could attract people's attention. However, the lower half of her body was completely made up of vines and roots. Bunches of thorns spread up her naked upper body, wrapping around her plump breasts and extending all the way to her neck and the edge of her cheeks. She smiled and pointed at the sword in Elman's hand. Young man, what do you expect this thing to do? Harm me? Or protect yourself? Elman frowned and pointed his sword at the woman, but he did not reply. This woman clearly came with ill intentions, and from her actions, she was either a lunatic or had a trump card. The Viscount believed that it was the latter. Rono's reaction was slower than Elman's, but when the black-haired youth saw the woman, he could not help but blush. He was stunned for a moment before he reacted. He raised his eyebrows and asked sternly, Who are you? This is Erwin's envoy. You better not have any ideas about us. The woman giggled. How cunning. She walked slowly towards them as if she did not see the sword in Elman's hand. The vines that made up her lower body wriggled as she walked, making her look like a giant worm that made one's scalp tingle. Rono, Master Hyman's apprentice, Kurlut's genius alchemist. Title, Wolverine. Once, in a conflict at Kurlut's Royal Academy of Magic, he heavily injured 11 of his companions, killing 2 of them. Beneath his shy appearance is a wild heart. As for Vahina, the Countess of Gold, the little princess of Flower Leaf, the beloved daughter of Duke Manderhill, and the only legitimate heir of the duchy, the woman turned around and looked at the other 2 with a smile, and Viscount Elman. Even though he's a bastard of a noble family, he's just as outstanding. But who can see through your ambitions? Elman's mouth twitched when he heard the word bastard. The woman continued, As for the last little girl, she's one of Erwin's people, but she's insignificant. But I'm interested in her liege, that interesting young man. Go find him if you're interested. Faina stared at the woman warily. As the heir of a great noble, she hated it when strangers called out her identity, shameless woman. She turned around, Rono, what are you looking at? The black-haired youth blushed and looked at Faina innocently. Now's not the time to talk about that, Faina. Faina gritted her teeth, none of you are good. Out of the 4 of them, only Tia, who was standing at the back, did not say anything. She was secretly prepared to take precautions. As a mercenary, even though this little wild elf girl did not have much experience, she still had some basic common sense. So, Elman watched as the woman got closer and closer, unable to hold back his anger. "Lady, what do you want?" He tried to stop her with his sword. But his words only elicited a smile from the woman. She walked closer to the Viscount and touched the tip of his sword with her finger. "As I said, you humans call this thing a sword. A sword is a weapon. It can protect you, but it can also be used to harm others. Because in your eyes, the human body is weak, but metal is strong. Using tools is the specialty of civilized creatures. Unfortunately, in my eyes, this thing is no different from you. It's weak, because all things will decay and wither. Only chaos will last forever." She lifted her eyelashes and looked at Elman with her purple eyes. As she spoke, purple roses bloomed on Elman's sword. As the petals withered, the Viscount's sword seemed to have experienced tens of thousands of years of history. It was as if it had been blown away by the wind. "Heretic." When the woman said, "Only chaos will last forever," the expressions of the three changed. However, this was nothing compared to the shock they felt when they saw Elman's sword shatter inch by inch. The element of decay. In all of Vaunt, there was only one person who was both a cultist and possessed the element of decay that they could immediately think of. Wither. 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 Vahina's face turned pale. She pointed at the woman with widened eyes, but she was so frightened that she could not say a word. Elman took a step back and pulled out his backup dagger. He knew that there was no way to end this peacefully the moment he realized the woman's identity. Since that was the case, there was no point in wasting words. He had to strike first and gain the upper hand. The black-haired youth's reaction was not slower than his. Almost as soon as the woman finished speaking, more than a dozen alchemy bombs were thrown at her. Unfortunately, the woman's reaction was faster than his. She waved her right hand and a net of vines rose from the ground. The alchemy bombs collided with the net and detonated prematurely, almost injuring Rono himself. The black-haired youth covered his face and rolled backwards. He stretched out his hand, and the magic devices on his body rose up one after another as he began to draw a magic circle. However, what left him dumbfounded was that the surface of these magic devices started to rust when they were only halfway there. Then, they dimmed and fell from the sky with a plop, falling into a puddle in the forest. He could no longer feel any magical connection with them. At this moment, Elman's attack began. His target was not the terrifying woman, but Vahina. Vahina was shocked when she saw Elman charging at her, but she still instinctively pulled out her sword to block him. Elemental energy flowed from her body into the thin sword, and a white light formed a shield around the blade. Unfortunately, this magic sword was not Elman's match. Elman knocked Vahina's sword away with a backhand and grabbed her by the neck. He circled behind her and placed his sword against her neck. The entire process happened in the blink of an eye. Rono and Tia were not the only ones who could not react. Even Vahina was shocked. However, Elman had already placed his sword against Vahina's snow-white neck. He looked at the woman and took a deep breath before calmly saying, "She's your target, right? But I don't think a dead heir of a duchy is of any value to you, is she?" Vahina was stunned for a moment. She took in a deep breath and couldn't help but tremble. She didn't know if it was because of the despairing environment or the betrayal of her companions. Yes, she suddenly thought of something. Elman must be doing this on purpose. He must be using this method to save the others. Thinking of this, she felt a little better. But when she thought of Viscount Elman's cold gaze when he sent her sword flying, she couldn't help but shiver. Rono looked at Elman in shock, but he seemed to have the same thought as Vahina and held back his words. On the other hand, Tia had cast a spell when Vahina was being held hostage. An ice dragon shot out from her palm, freezing the air with a crackling sound as it shot towards Elman. However, the moment Elman blocked Vahina's path, the noble lady, who had just calmed down, screamed in fright and closed her eyes. Tia was shocked as well. She hurriedly withdrew the spell in her hand. The icicle shattered with a crash, instantly turning into a cloud of sparkling dust in midair. "You're crazy!" Vahina screamed with her eyes closed. "Viscount Elman." "Shut up," Elman said coldly. "Speak less if you want to live." "You." The noble lady almost choked to death. She wanted to say something, but she felt the cold blade on her neck tighten. She was so scared that she swallowed the rest of her words. That despicable country bumpkin, sob sob sob, who can save me?" For some reason, this was the first thought that came to Vahina's mind as she was on the verge of tears. The woman not far away glanced at Tia. "Oh. A water elementalist. But elementalists don't have psychic abilities, right?" Tia's expression changed. "It's you. You're the one who cut off the telepathy between me and Brother Brando." "Oh. His name is Brando." The woman smiled. "Thank you, little girl." Tia was furious. She raised her hand and shot an ice arrow at the woman. Unfortunately, before the ice arrow could get close to the woman, it turned into ice dust and disappeared. The woman smiled. "Order is temporary. It's better to return to your original appearance." Then, she raised her hand, and countless vines extended toward Tia. Although the younger sister of the wild elf sisters tried to resist, she was tied up tightly after casting a few spells. "Woman," Elman watched as Tia was tied up as if it had nothing to do with him, then asked, "You haven't answered my question." "Your question?" The woman turned around and sneered. "Do you think your little tricks can fool me? Do you really think I don't dare to kill her?" Elman asked coldly. "Why don't you try?" Elman swung his sword horizontally, drawing a conspicuous line of blood on Vahina's snow-white neck. He raised his head and looked at the woman. "What about now?" "You're crazy!" Rono shouted. He glared at Elman, but he did not dare to act rashly. He was afraid that the madman would do something crazy. The woman was stunned. She had thought that Elman was trying to trick her, but she didn't expect him to be so crazy. She couldn't help but laugh. "Interesting. You want to live?" Elman nodded. "All right." The woman smiled and said, "I'll give you a chance. Kill him and come with me." She looked at Rono and said casually. Rono was stunned. Before he could react, he lowered his head and groaned. He looked at the arrow in his chest in disbelief, then at Elman. He knew that the arrow was poisoned. He had personally concocted the poison to deal with the monsters in the forest, but he never thought that he would be the first to test it. What he didn't expect was for Elman to act so decisively. He looked at his companion with a puzzled gaze and then fell backwards. "Rono!" Vahina couldn't believe her eyes. Her eyes turned red. "You're crazy, Viscount Elman. What did you do?" But Elman didn't even look at her. He held the sword against her neck and threw away the crossbow with his left hand. The woman looked at the scene with interest, then clapped her hands, as expected of Viscount Elman. "Clean and efficient. You have the potential to join us." She tilted her head and looked at the young noble with a smile. "So, what do you think?" Elman had no doubt that as long as he said no, the other party would immediately kill him without a burial place. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. The moment he nodded, the nerves that had been tense all this time finally relaxed. He thought that no matter how scary this woman was, she wouldn't attack a companion. Moreover, he was a rising star among the nobles of the empire. He believed that he had some value in her eyes. However, these thoughts only existed for a moment before they vanished. Because just as he nodded his head, a vine pierced his throat from behind like a ghost. Blood spurted out and splattered on Vahina's face. Only then did the noble lady feel the person who had been holding her hostage slowly fall down and fall heavily to the ground. But at that moment she was so scared that she didn't dare to move. Then, he knelt down with a crashed sound, unable to say a word. Not far away from her, the woman did not even look at her. She waved her hand and a tough vine whip appeared in her hand. The whip carried a gust of wind that was similar to Brendel's white raven sword style, and it swept across the ground with a swoosh. The sword swept past Vahina's body and split Elmund's body in two, sending him flying far away with a rain of blood. The woman retracted her whip and picked up Viscount Elmund's short sword. She then swung it at Tia. The dagger pierced through Tia's heart. Tia struggled for a moment before lowering her head. The woman smiled in satisfaction and sighed, "How foolish. You think I'm like those weak fellows from the unifying guild who yearns for power in this world. Power is but an illusion. One day, even the throne will turn to dust." She looked at Vahina and smiled, "But as for you, little girl, you're still useful to me. Come, I'll bring you to a good deal." But, I like the word deal humans use. P.S. It took some time to find someone to correct this. Thank you, Rocky and Apocalypse. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 404. Just as Tia entered the graveyard, Brando's party entered the outer region of the Loop of Trade Winds. The disappearance of Vahina and the others was just a small interlude to him. Even though Tia was among the missing, the wild elf was a card creature. Brando could always reset the mercenaries of Lopez card and summon her to his side. From the very beginning, Brando had no intention of going back to search for her. However, his decision to go deeper into the Loop of Trade Winds was strongly opposed by Erwin's party. Count Audine sternly demanded that he return to search for her. Indeed, if Brando was a real Erwin, he would have considered the consequences of the disappearance of Duke Cruz's daughter. Unfortunately, Brando's way of thinking was influenced by Sophie's modern personality. So what if they were Cruz's people? Even Veronica might not be able to protect herself from the calamity of wolves, not to mention the fact that they were heading back the same way they came from. If it was for his companions, Brando might have fought to the death, but for a few strangers, it was not worth it. What's more, those Kurlutzian nobles had schemed against him before. Brendel did not think he was a villain, but he was also not a modest gentleman who repaid evil with good. As for what the Erwin's party thought, Brando once again used his actions to show them that he did not care about the opinions of these people who used the banner of the royal faction. Brando was still sneering in his heart. These people always used the name of the kingdom to talk about things. When he was impatient, he would use the silver brooch of the Royal Knights Order to scare them to death. Most of the insignia of the Royal Knights Order were made of brass. Only the captains were given a silver brooch, while the commanders was gilded. In fact, captains were at least close attendants of the royal family. Compared to their relationship with the royal family, they were much closer than the people in the royal faction. Of course, Brendel knew that it was just a thought. Even though Princess Griffine had secretly given him the brooch, Brendel knew that she might not be willing to reveal her relationship with him. If he used the brooch to intimidate others, he was afraid that he would leave a bad impression on the future Princess Regent. With Brando's current strength, he did not care about the impression he would leave in the princess's mind. However, he did not want that to happen. So, he decided to ignore the nobles. He knew that they would not dare to leave his party. The 20+ of them wandering around in the Black Forest was just like delivering food to the monsters. The calamity of wolves was not the only monster in the Black Forest. As he expected. Although Brando did not agree with Count Audine's position, he was still clear-headed. Seeing the young man's stubbornness, he did not turn back like Dolent did. Instead, he shamelessly followed them. He knew that if he chose to turn back, it was very likely that his party would never be able to return. Brendel looked back at the Aween's envoys from afar, and a mysterious smile appeared on his face. He raised his head again, and his gaze passed through the darkness of the night, quietly gazing at the undulating shadows of the mountains in the distance. In that direction, the Thorn Ridge formed a wide range of hills to the south and east of the Wall of Roses. Once they crossed the hills, they would enter the Kalanga mountain range's northern branch. Brando had already forgotten the name of the branch, but even if it was the Thorn Ridge area, it was still considered the periphery of the loop of trade winds. In fact, when he looked around, he could already see a thin layer of white gauze-like fog in the dark forest. This was under the condition that the wall of clouds of the loop of trade winds had opened up a path in the clouds. If it was any other day, this place would already be covered in fog. Whether it was in the southeast or the southwest, they could see the towering wall of clouds. The dark clouds even covered the stars. Because it was so high, when people looked up, they would have the illusion that the clouds on both sides were curved toward the center. Being in this path of clouds, people would suddenly have the illusion that they were contained in it, and they would immediately have the illusion that they were small and contained in it. Even if it was just a casual glance, it was enough to shock him. Brando took a deep breath. He saw the blue light flowing above the canopy of the dark forest. It was the purest magic power, unaffected by any kind of power. However, this magic power quickly sank into the barbarian land and turned black. Then, it formed into monsters in the forest. The tide of magic had come, and the air seemed to be filled with such a smell. A silver moon shone on the mountains and the dense forest. But then he was slightly startled. The green light in his vision changed and formed a line of small words that was projected infinitely far away. Mercenaries of Lopez, Tia has entered the graveyard. Brando was surprised. He immediately stopped and contacted the wild elf girl. To be honest, it was not unexpected that she met with trouble in the dark forest. However, he was still surprised that it happened so quickly. After all, Tia was a silver-ranked elementalist. Even if she met with a small wolf pack, she would at least have the ability to escape. Unless she met with a male wolf. Could it be that there was a third wolf pack in this area? This made Brando a little cautious. He first comforted the little girl. It was funny. This was the second time the little girl had entered the graveyard alone. He did not know why this cute little girl was always so unlucky. Could it be because the lucky girl took all her luck? Dio was stronger than he had imagined. This little girl first complained to him about how painful it was to be stabbed to death by a sword. The Lord must avenge her and so on. Then, she briefly described the situation at that time. His heart skipped a beat when he heard Tia talk about the ability to turn weapons and magic into dust and disappear with the wind. There were many spells that could cause this effect, but if it was paired with the unique purple rose withering effect, then it would be a different story. There was only one possibility. In Brando's opinion, the element of corrosion was not a very powerful element. However, the person who mastered this element was enough to make his heart skip a beat. The Lord of Withering, Andesha, one of the 12 patriarchs of the tree herders. With Martha as her superior, she was almost the strongest existence in Wonde. Why is she here? Brando's heart skipped a beat. He thought that it was ridiculous enough for him to create a reaction that attracted Cruz's people, Buga's Magi, and the Holy Cathedral of Fire. He did not expect the tree herders to be involved. Was the Lionheart sword that attractive? He immediately reacted. If the Lionheart sword was really a part of the Scepter of Fire, then the tree herders' presence here would be understandable. The Four Wise Ones were one of their biggest rivals. They were the first to prevent the Four Wise Ones' weapon from being reborn. This explanation was acceptable. Brando was not surprised at the death of Viscount Elman and the young alchemist after knowing that Andesha was here. Even if there were 10 of him, he would not be able to defeat a single finger of that woman's. But Brando was slightly relieved. Andesha's actions when she kidnapped Vahina suggested that her target was Cruz's envoy. That was good too. Among the Kurlut's people, there was Veronica, the goddess of war of the Azure Skies Legion. At this time, Veronica's strength should be around level 70, which was the peak of the Wall of Law, elemental domain. Although she was probably not Andesha's opponent, Veronica was probably not the only one in the Kurlut's envoy group. Brando was very clear that Cruz's people were divided into several factions. Other than the Knights faction represented by the army, there were also the astrologers, the court magicians, and the Holy Cathedral. Since the Holy Cathedral of Fire was going alone this time, there should at least be people from the Archmage Madron's side in the Kurlut's envoy. After listening to Tia's description, Brando calmed down and thought for a while. He thought that Cruz's mission this time was led by Veronica, so according to their rules, there should be at least 2 high-level magi in the envoy. With 2 high-level magi in Veronica, it was no wonder that Andesha did not dare to act rashly. But when the 2 sides met, it was inevitable that they would be impulsive. Brando could not help but start thinking about it. 2 high-level magi clashing with each other, and their strength was almost the same. What did this mean in the previous game? Brando's eyes lit up. This was the best opportunity to take advantage of the situation. If it was in the past, he wouldn't have hesitated to turn around and see if he could get anything out of this mess. Taking advantage of opportunities was one of the basic attributes of a player. However, he quickly calmed down and remembered that he was no longer a player. The battle between NPCs like Veronica and Andesha was not something that he could interfere with. If he was unlucky, it was understandable that he would die 10 or 20 times over. If it was in the previous game, he might be able to get back some money no matter how many times he died. But it was different here. Brando quickly forced himself to throw this terrifying thought out of his mind. He was afraid that he would lose his life in a moment of recklessness. He took a deep breath and felt a little relieved. No matter how strong Andesha was, she would not have thought of Tia's identity. Thus, that woman would not have thought that her whereabouts had been exposed. But since he knew that the old witch was active in this area, her threat was much smaller. Brando knew the 12 patriarchs of the tree herders very well. He had even fought with some of them personally. As for their habits and movements, he knew them like the back of his hand. "Is it okay?" Tia asked in puzzlement. "That woman looks very strong. Don't worry. She might be in danger in the dark. But thank you, Tia." Tia smiled sweetly. At this moment, Brando looked up and immediately heard a familiar voice ask, "What's wrong?" Brando paused for a moment, then saw Amandina looking at him with concern. Her bright eyes in the dark made Brando feel a little uncomfortable. "Why does it seem like this noble's attention is always on me?" "Nothing. What are you doing?" Brando asked. "Elder Wade has been looking for you for a long time, but you've been distracted the entire time. I told him that you were thinking about something, but he didn't dare to disturb you." The noble girl paused for a moment. There seemed to be other adventurers up ahead. "You'd better go take a look." "Aw." Brando was stunned. P.S. That was 4,000 words at noon. Students, seeing how awesome I am, please give me some recommendations, monthly votes, etc., to be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 405. What was in the Black Forest? That was a secret in itself. Rather than saying that Elder Widd had found adventurers, it was more accurate to say that he had found their corpses. More than 30 corpses were strewn all over the forest. The corpses were dressed in light gray robes with silver armor underneath. Brando lifted the robes of the corpses and saw the crimson flame symbol on the silver armor. As expected, these were the guards of the Holy Cathedral. In fact, he had already noticed this when he entered the forest with Quinn and the centaur elder Widd. The swords scattered on the ground were also Cruz's style, but only the guards of the Holy Cathedral would be so ostentatious with their swords. If it were any other human army, he would have seen more or less battle axes or other standard weapons. Lifting his outer robe, he was now certain of this. They are the grey-robed soldiers of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. He straightened up and said to Quinn and elder Widd. I wonder if there are any flame guards. They probably didn't encounter wolves, but it's strange to see more than 30 corpses neatly placed here. Elder Widd said. Yes, if the Holy Cathedral had kept the corpses, they wouldn't have left their companions' corpses exposed in the wilderness. Even if they didn't have time, they would still have buried them. They knew that there were wolves in the forest. Brando walked to the next corpse and lifted the robes. Another soldier monk. More importantly, there are no signs of a fight. Quinn said. The occasional cries of the owls in the forest made his ears twitch. It's as if they just fell asleep. There are no obvious wounds on their bodies. Are they all the same? They are all the same. Brando finished examining the first 3 corpses. He then looked up and across the forest to the other side. There were more than 30 corpses lying on the ground or leaning against the trees. They were more or less in the same posture as when they were alive. Their eyes were closed and their weapons were not far from them. It was as if they had really fallen asleep. However, their pale and lifeless skin proved that they were dead people who had lost all signs of life. This scene was extremely strange. The centaur elder Widd and the tree elf leader Quinn did not make a sound. They were not surprised by the strange situation. No one could understand the dark forest. The deeper one ventured into the forest, the more it was like a giant nightmare that could silently enter one's dreams and take one's life. However, Brando's thoughts were different from theirs. It's just that I don't know if his life was taken away in an instant or if he had experienced something before. What was the cause of all this? Is it a wolf? Brando walked silently among the corpses, not daring to jump to conclusions. However, compared to the helplessness of the 2 natives, Brando had already found some clues from the state of the corpses. After all, the experience of a level 130 warrior was not for nothing. Regardless of whether it was Wade or Quinn, both of them had to address him as their senior. Brando suddenly stopped beside a corpse. He squatted down and saw that the soldier monk was holding a golden amulet tightly in his hand. He forcefully pulled the amulet out of the monk's hand. At the same time, he confirmed the time of death. The body was slightly stiff and the fingers were cold, no different from a wax figure. Brando then placed his hand on the monk's chest. There was still a trace of warmth. It seemed that the Holy Cathedral had just passed by. However, those people were one step ahead of him, which surprised Brando. This meant that the Holy Cathedral of Fire also knew about the Druids' plan and made use of them. These powerful forces are really good at gathering information. Brando could not help but think. However, he also knew that the Druids' plan was to hide from small forces like the Golden Mane Toquinin and Erwin. The Wizards of Buga, the Holy Cathedral, and the people of Cruz had probably already guessed the outcome of tonight's operation. In other words, they were probably heading deeper into the Ring of Clouds. Brando raised his head and looked at the corpse in the forest. Was it really that easy to enter the loop of trade winds? No matter how powerful these giants were, they probably would not have guessed that he had already experienced it before. The deeper he went into this world, the more Brando felt that the players were once superior. He then raised the amulet and looked at it. In the middle of the amulet was a diamond-shaped amethyst. The amethyst had been blown up by the runaway magic. It was rumored that amethyst could ward off evil spirits, so it was often used to make amulets to ward off evil spirits. The fact that the soldier monk died with this amulet in his hand meant that he was already aware of the danger. Then, his life wouldn't have been taken away in an instant. Brando immediately came to this conclusion. He then habitually wanted to keep the amulet in his bag, thinking that it could still be used. The items used by the Holy Cathedral were generally not bad. However, he quickly reacted. After all, this was not a game. If he touched the belongings of the dead, who knew if the two behind him would throw their halberds at him? Centaurs and tree elves respected the dead and the spirits the most. Brando put the amulet back into the hand of the dead soldier. It was not worth the risk since it was not a good item. In fact, Brando could already feel the gazes of Wydd and Quinn on him. He stood up and said with certainty, "These soldier monks were left behind to cover the rear." Cover the rear. The centaur elder was stunned. He saw the young human walking between the corpses and occasionally squatting down to examine them. At first, he was slightly disdainful. Corpses would leave behind information, but only veterans, professional hunters, and professional priests who had walked through mountains of corpses and seas of blood would be able to read the information. Wydd himself was an expert in this field. As a veteran warrior, he could easily distinguish whether the wounds were caused by blades, bites, or the effects of some kind of magic. However, when faced with such strange corpses, he was helpless. That young man walked around the corpses twice and could tell that they were left behind to cover the rear. That was probably just a guess. The centaur elder could not help but frown. As a commander, it was irresponsible to jump to conclusions so easily. He turned to look at the tree elves beside him. Quinn was also frowning, but the tree elves shook their heads at him, indicating for him to calm down. These indecisive tree stumps. The centaur elder, Wydd, was dissatisfied. Brando did not seem to notice Wydd's indifference. He walked to the other side and observed the battlefield. Then he confirmed a direction and pointed in that direction. It seems that the people from the Holy Cathedral came from that direction. It's similar to ours. Wydd was stunned. Quinn was also slightly surprised. When they found the corpses, they had ordered their men to search the area carefully. The druids were experts in this field. It did not take long for them to determine the direction the humans had entered and left from based on the fallen vegetation in the forest. Brando's judgment was almost the same as theirs. What? You don't believe me? Brando looked at their shocked expressions. You just have to search in that direction. There should be many traces left behind in the forest. No, Quinn asked. We just want to know how you know. Well. Brando thought that the Holy Cathedral had been using this kind of formation since the beginning of the game. This formation with 4 guards in the middle was modified by the players and became the most popular formation in the game. It was flexible, and there was enough time to react in case of an emergency. However, as the commander, he was very familiar with this kind of formation. Brando walked to the side of a tree. The Holy Cathedral entered the forest from this direction. The left wing swept through the forest. The scouts first discovered the enemy and then alerted the others here. He looked up and saw a corpse on the top of the tree. He then took 2 steps to the left. This corpse was the furthest away from the encampment. The enemy was too fast. There was no time to react, so the first to face the enemy was the Grey Knight on the periphery, the Holy Cathedral scouts. He lifted his robe and saw the insignia of the Grey Knight. Scarlet. Brendel turned around and shouted, "Come over here, go over there." He pointed to a position and said to Scarlet. The red-haired girl was originally standing beside Amandina and was observing the situation from afar, but she could not help but be startled when she heard the order. But as Brando's follower, her duty was to obey. Even though she did not understand, she still walked over. Brando used his hand to draw a circle around the position of the Grey Knight. He then looked at Wild and Quinn. The Grey Knight surrounded them in a semicircle with a wide distance. Their mission in this formation was to stall for time. These are the elites of the Holy Cathedral. They are well trained and are well aware of this. But there was no battle. Brando gestured for Scarlet to come over. She walked past the 6 corpses of the Grey Knight. They fell. The last Grey Knight must have been scared out of his wits. He began to turn around here. Brando looked at the traces of broken vegetation at his feet. He then raised his head and looked in another direction. He ran in that direction, but he was caught. There was no battle, and he fell down dead. Brando said as he looked at the corpse. The enemy is strong. Brando gestured for Scarlet to continue walking into the forest. The left-wing guards were prepared to face the enemy. The Holy Cathedral's decision was to have them cover the rear. They then left in that direction. He pointed outside the forest as if he had seen the situation with his own eyes. Wade and Quinn turned their heads back at the same time, and their expressions changed. Brendel had guessed correctly again. At this time, everyone heard a series of footsteps coming from outside the forest. The centaur elder and the tree elf leader turned around nervously. But they saw Aruan's men. It seemed to be a guy called Count Audine. In fact, Brando had ordered the troops to stop halfway up the mountain. Count Audine was really impatient, so he came up to check on the situation. But when he came up, he was shocked. The forest was littered with corpses. P.S. The battle for Valhalla has officially begun. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 406. When Count Audine saw the red emblem of the Holy Cathedral of Fire on the shining armor under the robes of the corpses, his expression changed again. Of course, he knew the soldiers of the Holy Cathedral. But so many of them had died. For Martha's sake, he knew the strength of the Holy Cathedral the best. He could not imagine what kind of enemy could make the monks of the Holy Cathedral of Fire pay such a high price. Count Audine's gaze continued to move forward. The Grey Knight. When he saw the corpses at Brendel's feet, he was so shocked that he could not speak. These corpses were at least at the level of a priestess, which meant that there was at least one priestess in the Holy Cathedral team. Audine could not help but gasp. More than 30 soldiers of the Holy Cathedral died even with the help of a priest, and the Grey Knight. Who did the people of the Holy Cathedral meet? A priest of the Holy Cathedral must at least have elemental activation. As a spell profession that had elemental activation, it should be enough to win against a male wolf. However, the Count immediately had some strange thoughts. He looked at Brando and wondered if the young man had killed the soldiers of the Holy Cathedral. After all, in his opinion, there seemed to be nothing that the lawless young baron did not dare to do. He did not even care about Cruz's people. Maybe he really would do something so earth-shattering. Count Audine then thought of the relationship between Brando and the Druids. For a moment, he could not help but think, could it be that these Druids wanted to start the Holy War? The high-ranking general from the Northern Legion swallowed a mouthful of saliva. However, Brando's words dispelled the Count's doubts. Of course, Brando noticed Audine's arrival, but he did not even look at the latter. Instead, he continued to walk through the forest and said, the real battle began here. He asked Scarlet to stop, then pointed to the forest and said, the battle ended the moment the enemy approached. Everyone thought they had attacked, but their weapons were still in their hands, and their arrows were still on the bow. Then the first batch of people died. Brando crossed the line of defense formed by the 10 soldier monks. They were all lying on the ground. Death is silent, like a breeze that brushed past their bodies. He looked at the corpses of the 10 soldier monks. They had all died at the same time. He looked up, and the invisible enemy continued to move forward. The second group of monk soldiers tried to pull away to buy time, but they fell at the same time. In the end, the remaining people seemed to have broken down. Some of them started to run away. This is why these corpses did not form a perfect defensive circle in the end. Brando replied. He looked around the forest. Judging from the arrangement of the monk soldiers, the creature was huge, but it passed through the forest without a sound. It must have used some kind of illusion when it took these people's lives, so there was no sign of a fight until death. But we can't rule out the possibility that it created an illusion to mislead these people. But if that's the case, the others from the holy sanctum shouldn't be able to escape. Brando looked at Wade and Quinn, and then at Austin who was beside them. His calm gaze sent a chill down the 3 men's spines. It was as if there was a terrifying monster lurking in the forest, and it would hear their conversation at any time and appear like a giant ghost. The 3 of them were actually warriors who had experienced hundreds of battles, but this black forest was too strange. Those who were not familiar with it would feel a suffocating mystery, but those who were familiar with it could only see more of the unknown. But they could not imagine how the young man could stand in front of them and talk so casually. Have you heard of something like this? Brando looked back at the forest again. In fact, the current situation puzzled him. It was not that he had never seen a similar attack, but there were too many answers that fit the description. Moreover, no one dared to say that they had seen all the monsters in the wilderness. Some of the creatures born from chaos and magic did not make sense. Perhaps this terrifying killer was really a breeze that brushed past the forest. Perhaps, in order to narrow down the scope of the answer, he had to find the answer from the natives like Wade and Quinn. Brando thought that if he were to complete this plot with the mentality of a quest, then he would understand that there would be no quest that did not provide clues. It sounds like a ghost. Only a ghost in the legends would silently take away a person's life. Brando did not expect Count Austin to be the first to speak. After a brief moment of astonishment, the Count from the kingdom began to reevaluate Brando. Perhaps it was his occupational disease, but Brando's reenactment of the battle was a new experience for him. If it was said that the Count had been looking at Brando with his personal feelings and prejudice, then he finally noticed some details that he had not noticed before. For example, when did such a person appear in Erewhon? The more he thought about it, the more he felt that something was amiss. What Baron of Abbey's domain? Isn't Abbey's domain located in Tonagel? If I'm not mistaken, isn't that Count Randner's worthless son the lord of this backwater village? Of course, as the most central existence in the noble circle, he was not sure if he remembered correctly, but he did not believe that this mysterious young noble was a country bumpkin lord. In his opinion, the so-called most outstanding young people of this generation that were widely rumored in the noble circles were nothing more than this. Most of them were just boastful people, but this baron in front of him was truly in an environment that was 1,000 times more dangerous than a battlefield, and yet he was still able to talk and laugh as if nothing had happened. Count Austin could not help but look at Brando with a strange gaze. He subconsciously thought that this person was lying. A ghost? Brando shook his head. First of all, it was impossible for there to be a ghost as large as a hill. Moreover, a ghost's method of attack was to steal the temperature of life, so the creatures they killed should at least be covered in a layer of ice. Elder Widd and Leader Quinn shook their heads as well. There were many ghosts in the dark forest, and they had also dealt with them before, but it was clear that the current situation was different. Brando could not help but shake his head when he saw that no one could give him an explanation. He actually had a faint premonition in his heart. The moment they entered the loop of trade winds, they encountered such a scene. Or rather, the people from the Holy Cathedral of Fire were one step ahead of them and were attacked. Brando suspected that the creature hiding in the fog was the one that attacked the druids. But the creature only forced the druids to retreat, and now it started to kill them. Was it because the intruders were different, or was it because of the appearance of the path in the clouds? But no matter what, Brando knew that this creature should be the boss of this storyline quest. Even the Holy Cathedral of Fire did not seem to have the ability to resist, and only left behind more than 30 corpses. How strong is this thing? Brando faced such a conjecture without batting an eyelid, but his heart was filled with joy. It was fortunate that the guys from the Holy Cathedral of Fire were quick enough to block the attack for him. Otherwise, he really did not know if he could deal with this terrifying thing head-on. Originally, he thought that the player in the Amber Sword was much weaker than he was now, but he was still able to enter Valhalla and complete the quest. This meant that this quest shouldn't be too difficult. But he did not expect, holy shit, so that guy really did stumble into the center of the loop of trade winds by accident. Brando could not help but curse in his heart. But even so, his experience as a leader calmed him down quickly. Since he could enter the loop of trade winds by accident, it meant that this quest was not completely impossible. Otherwise, with the strength of this boss, not to mention the players at that time, it was estimated that the game would not be able to do anything even after 20 years. But fighting was definitely not feasible, so the goal of the quest should be to avoid fighting and find another way. But where was this shortcut? Brando was at a loss. No one would be willing to release the details of this quest for free, and those paid posts were too expensive. Who would spend money on a one-time quest that had already been completed? But Brando was now filled with regret. If he had known this would happen, he would not have thought that way. Veronica, the Magus of Buga, and the terrifying Endesha. Now, there was the boss that was even more terrifying than the three of them combined. Brando suddenly had a headache. He could not help but wonder if the difficulty of this quest could be a little bit higher. This was just an early storyline quest, wasn't it? Brando patted his forehead and subconsciously looked around to see if there were any clues. But when he turned around, he saw Scarlet staring blankly at her hand. He could not help but be startled. This red-haired girl did not have the habit of being absent-minded at this time. Scarlet. Scarlet was slightly surprised and raised her head. Brando thought that she had discovered something and asked, "What's wrong?" "There's something on my hand." Scarlet looked at her hand worriedly. Brando was startled. He thought that the blood of gods had relapsed. But what made him feel strange was that the effects of the golden apple should not have disappeared so quickly. But when he looked at her arm, he saw strange golden patterns on it. No matter how he looked at it, these patterns did not seem like the signs of the blood of gods. Instead, it seemed like magic was flowing under her skin. Brando felt that the patterns were familiar, but he could not remember where he had seen them before. He thought for a moment and shook his head. "This is not the blood of gods." "Don't worry. But I think it's the effect of the golden apple." "The golden apple itself contains a lot of magic," he looked up, "so the magic in your body resonates with the demonic wave. This is a good thing, not a bad thing." "A good thing." Scarlet's worry faded a little. She knew that Brando would never lie to her, but she was still puzzled by Brando's words. Brando nodded. "Yes, I may have thought of a way to make you an elementalist. But I'll have to wait until Lady Orthless wakes up before I can ask her about it." He could not help but sigh. Orthless was obviously a heroic spirit, but she did not have the self-awareness of a heroic spirit. She would sleep for 12 hours every day without fail. For Martha's sake, a heroic spirit should not have wrinkles. P.S. Looking for votes, looking for recommendations. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 408. The monks of the Holy Cathedral opened up a path in the forest, leading the unknown monster to some unknown place. However, Brando did not have the guts to follow. Who knew if the boss would turn back? However, as a Lord-tier monster, the entire periphery of the loop of trade winds was its range of activity. As long as they were still in the loop of trade winds, Brando knew that the chances of encountering the boss were very high. Moreover, according to the usual settings of the Amber Sword, the deeper they went, the more likely it was that the boss would be alerted. It was obviously not easy to complete Valhalla's quest easily. Fortunately, the Holy Cathedral had excellent Grey Knight scouts, but Brando's scouts were not bad either. In fact, the Fireclaw Lizardmen were slightly better. They were not the most professional scouts, but the telepathic connection between the planeswalker and the summoned creatures played a special role in this environment. There was no distance limit or time delay for telepathic connection, so Brando could expand the Fireclaw Lizardmen's range of vigilance by several times compared to normal scouts. In order to make the perimeter even tighter, Brando also showed the Fireclaw Bugler card. When the fiery red lizard man with the horn entered the field, the card immediately activated its ability and sent another platoon of Fireclaw assault spearmen into the field. The number of Fireclaw assault spearmen under Ropar suddenly doubled. Fortunately, most of the Fireclaw assault spearmen were out of sight, so the sudden increase in numbers did not arouse suspicion. Fireclaw lizard men, countless wind spirit spiders, more than 30 rock leopards, 2 shadow rock beasts, and a black wolf lord, Brando had an impenetrable warning system. It was soon noon when the team left the Holy Cathedral of Fire was first attacked. This was the third phase of the Planeswalker's 6 phases of the day. Brando tapped Ember Volcano to increase the number of fire elementals in the elemental pool, and at the same time, he drew a Vampire Baron card from his deck into his hand. It was a pity that the Scorching Sun phase did not allow the use of black cards. Otherwise, Brando would have decisively placed this card into the field. What he lacked now was the best scouts. Blood Descendants were known for their speed. Coupled with their abilities as planeswalkers, they could be said to be the best land scouts in the world. Not to mention, they could also fly short distances. After he finished drawing his cards, he looked up and saw that the fog in the mountain forest had begun to sink. The white mountain fog swirled around the forest in layers, lingering in the forest. In fact, the few gold-ranked powerhouses present had already keenly sensed that some of the unstable elements in the air were increasing. This was the rise and fall of the chaos sea beneath the elemental boundary, which caused the Black Moon's light to become even more dazzling. Magic power was welcoming the beginning of the strongest era in the past 1,000 years. It was just like the rise and fall of the tides, roaring to the entire world. The power of primal chaos became obvious. The most obvious change was that the temperature of the hills around Thorn Ridge suddenly became cold. It was as if they had entered a severe winter within a few hours. Everyone could even see frost forming on the tree trunks under their gazes. Everyone could not help but think of a hair-raising term, frost tide. It was one of the scariest natural disasters in the outer reaches of the dark forest. The temperature would drop below zero in just a few hours. Without the necessary protection, the extreme cold weather could kill any living thing within the affected area. Even the demons were not spared. Except for one. Winter wolves. Frost tide. Frost tide is coming. The centaurs immediately took out a pendant that looked like a crystal bowl. The crystal ball was wrapped in a golden thread, and within it was a small fire seed. This fire seed could not open up a land of order, but it was like a torch in the darkness. It could at least stabilize the order in a small area of primal chaos. After leaving the Green Tower, adventurers would have to bring along a small fire seed if they wanted to go deeper into the forest. Otherwise, the harsh weather would kill anyone who ventured deep into the forest. It was a pity that not everyone understood this logic. The centaurs took out a fire seed and ignited it. A pillar of light shot up into the sky. Brando looked up and saw dark clouds gathering in the sky. Martha's codex, Tiamat, was dozens of miles behind the clouds in the sky. The outermost ring of gears at the edge of the transparent ring had already shattered. Black magic power was gathering. It was like a huge tentacle covering the sky. Then, the southern sky flashed with layers of dark blue light, like thunder and lightning. The demonic wave was coming. Brando took out a fire seed from his chest. He naturally would not forget such an important matter. He cast 2 spells with his thumb and index finger, and the fire seed in his hand glowed brightly. A pillar of light shot up into the sky. Brando looked up. The pillar of light pierced through the dark clouds like a sharp thorn in the sky. The pillar of light flickered in his hand, reflecting the light of the centaurs not far away. Elder Wydd turned around to look at him in surprise. He didn't expect this young man to be so knowledgeable to even prepare something like this. Not every adventurer had the experience of exploring the Black Forest. Only the experienced adventurers would be well prepared and not panic in the face of the frightening power of the Black Forest. A third pillar of light lit up. It was the fire seed in Quinn's hand. It was not difficult to create a small fire seed. In the game, it only cost a few thousand tor. Here, it was as simple as a piece of agate. "You've been to the Black Forest before?" Elder Wydd asked as he walked over. Brando did not answer him directly. The frost tide was just a prelude, but at least it indicated that the second wave of attack would be the winter solstice wolves. In history, the first wave of wolves was the shadow, and the second wave was the plague. This time, there was a slight deviation from history. Brando thought that it might be because the NPCs here were different from the ones in history. A slight change in the order of the world could affect the course of history in the Black Forest. He felt a few cold snowflakes hitting his face and melting. The snowflakes were as hard as steel outside the range of the fire seed, but as soon as they entered the range of the fire seed, they quickly melted and shrunk. The second wave of wolves. Brando nodded and looked up. The demonic wave is coming. What? Look carefully. I'm afraid you won't be able to see such a magnificent scene twice in your life. Brando looked up at the sky and replied. Wydd turned his head and looked up as well. Then, a gust of wind suddenly rose from the ground. The air swirled upward and brought countless dead trees and weeds into the sky. They gathered and formed a huge curtain of wind. The wind blew through the rolling mountains and hit everyone's face, blowing leaves and branches into the air. At that moment, everyone could not help but look up. Their hair fluttered in the wind, and they were surprised to see layers of leaves lifted from the treetops flying into the air. It was as if countless leaves were dancing in the air, converging into a black river hanging in the sky above the mountains. The river was moving forward. The fluttering leaves made it seem like a black army was marching. And higher up in the sky, thick black clouds rolled, and the clouds swept toward the middle of the sky like a tide. The sky in all directions surged, and everyone saw a flash of purple lightning shuttling through the clouds. The lightning lit up the clouds, but there was no rolling thunder. It was just silent lightning. Brando looked back and suddenly saw another beam of light shooting into the sky. It was fiery red and huge. It should be the fire seed of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. However, in the darkness, this light seemed to have awakened its other brethren sleeping in the forest. Beam after beam, in a moment, dozens of light beams were reflected in Brando's eyes. The orange-red, Cruz people. The Order of Fire they controlled was not as pure as the Holy Cathedral of Fire, although they claimed to be the descendants of the Flame King Gretel. However, the gold of the Eagle Empire was added to the heat of fire. This color was enough to make them proud. Light green, that should be another druid. Then there was blue. Even the wind elves were here. Brando could not help but mutter in his heart. He could not figure out why the Lionheart sword was so attractive. However, what Brando did not consider was that he had triggered a reaction from the divine artifact. In the face of a divine artifact, no country would not be tempted. There were also a few light red ones. Brando guessed that they should be the knight orders of some duchy. The gray ones were naturally adventurers and mercenaries who did not belong to any faction. Brando's own fire seed was bought from the Green Tower. The fire seed made by the Druids was naturally strong and gentle, so it was light green. It was similar to the fire seed in the hands of Wade and Quinn not far from him. There were 30 to 40 fire seeds in the forest. There were even more adventurers who did not prepare well enough and were annihilated by the extreme cold. Outside the range of the fire seed, the temperature dropped at an unbelievable rate. A layer of frost formed on the trees, and then the branches turned into ice crystals that fell to the ground. Snow began to fall from the sky, and in a short 10 minutes, the surrounding world was covered in white. Normal people who had not reached the strength of a gold would die in a few minutes in such an environment. Gold elementalists would only be able to survive for a day or two. Only those who had activated their elemental powers would not be affected. Brando took a deep breath. When he saw this scene, his heart was slightly shaken. It was not because of fear or nervousness, but because this scene was so familiar. It was as if time had turned back, and he was back in the game, fighting side by side with the first batch of pioneers. That was not a story that belonged to him. But now, it was. He looked further into the distance. The fire seed in the wall of roses had dimmed, and the pillar of light that shot into the sky was flickering. But since the wolves had not taken down the outpost, there was not much left to do. The druids of the Wall of Roses had managed to hold on, and it was due to the combined efforts of the various factions in this direction. Further away, the Green Tower's light was like a lighthouse in the dark. The pillar of light from the fire seed was like a golden sword piercing into the dark sky. But from afar, other than the northernmost 7 of the 12 outposts around the Green Tower, most of them were either dimmed or extinguished. Chaos brought lightning, rain, and snow. The weather in the distance was extremely strange. Rain poured down from the mountains in some places, and lightning flashed in others. There were even thin ribbons in the sky. Those were tornadoes. The moment he turned around, he saw a huge pillar of light flickering for a moment before it was extinguished. The fire seed had been extinguished forever, and with it came the flames of countless lives. The weak advantage of the Wall of Roses was not enough to cover the fact that the Druids' entire defense line was shaky. Even with the help of the players, the Druids were only able to defend against 4 waves of attacks. If not for the opening of Valhalla, the calamity of wolves in the dark forest would have turned this area into ruins. That's why, Brando turned around and said, "The second wave of attacks is coming. Let's hurry up. This forest is getting dangerous." Brando frowned when he said that. The winter solstice wolf pack was quite troublesome. The winter wolf was a very high-level magical creature. Although their numbers were smaller than the black wolf, they were much more terrifying. The northerners called the winter wolves ghosts that breathed in frost and fog, and it was not an exaggeration. If they were even a step slower in this forest, they would die without a burial place. That place. Wade looked at the place where the pillar of light had disappeared and was stunned. Ha! P.S. Wah wah, it's still too late. Put up 2 chapters first, I'll continue writing. If you don't finish writing the 3rd chapter before 11 o'clock, then you don't have to wait. Get up early tomorrow and put it up. So, I'm still short of 2 chapters. Chapter 409. That place. WYRD stared at the spot where the pillar of light had disappeared. It's nothing. The elder centaur seemed to have regained his senses. He turned around and walked towards the group of centaurs. "What's wrong?" Amandina asked curiously when she saw Wade's reaction. Before the frost hit, she had put on a long shawl to protect herself from the cold. "That direction is the Arbor Forest, the homeland of many centaurs in the Green Tower," Brando replied. "Ah." Amandina looked at the elder centaur's back sympathetically. "But how did you know, my lord? Didn't the Deadwood Guardian Guide mention it yesterday?" Brando asked. "I think so." Amandina was taken aback, but he only mentioned it casually. "How did my lord remember it?" She looked at Brando with envy and surprise. Brando quickly pretended to check his sword to prevent himself from laughing out loud when he saw Amandina's serious expression. "Nonsense, how can I remember it? The problem is that the 12 outposts around the Green Tower, there will be 17 in the future, have become famous because of Valhalla. But this is not a good reason to tell others." "All right, let's go." Brendel interrupted the topic and said to Amandina. The wolves are coming." The forest was now completely dark, and the dim starlight and moonlight were hidden behind the clouds. When the demonic wave arrived, the world became pitch black, and the pillars of light in the forest became the only source of light in the world. The pillars of light were moving slowly. Brando felt a sense of déjà vu when he saw the first calamity of wolves in a video. Back then, only a few of the strongest players participated in the calamity of wolves. In the dark storm, a small number of players raised their fire seed and advanced towards Valhalla. The 20 pillars of light were like the last flickering flames of hope in the vast land. But they succeeded in the end. As for whether he would succeed, Brando did not know. He looked around. The forest was already silvery gray in the dark. With his near 25-ounce perception, he could see a white shadow flashing in the forest a few miles away. It was the winter wolf. The centaur elder Widd's voice came from the front of the group, and the group began to move forward. Previously, after trekking for nearly 10 hours, the group had already approached the southern end of the Thorn Ridge. A few miles away, two intersecting black mountain ridges formed the entrance to the Kalanga mountain range. The terrain became undulating and precipitous in that direction, but as long as they passed through there, they would have passed the first checkpoint. Based on the team's speed, it would take them at most an hour to reach their destination. But that place was known as the Wolf Pass. It was also the most dangerous part of the journey. Brando looked around and saw that there were more and more winter wolves in the forest ahead, but he knew that this was just the beginning. The winter solstice wolves still needed some time to gather. He took out his pocket watch and saw that it was less than 90 minutes before the second wave of wolves arrived. "Looks like we're just in time," Brando thought to himself. The group slowly passed through the last stretch of the Thorn Ridge. Occasionally, a few winter wolves would rush out from the snow, and naturally, they were greeted by the centaur's arrows. Although Brando had already set up a tight perimeter around the group, the Fireclaw lizards, Shadow Rock beasts, and Shadow wolves. Even though Brando called them rock beasts, it was a pity that Amandina, Coden, Carglass, and even Scarlet thought that it was a terrible name, so they simply ignored Brando's decision and called them Shadow wolves. In short, the perimeter that Brando had set up was to prevent the mysterious Lord-tier monsters from entering. As for the lone winter wolf, he did not mind the Fireclaw lizards helping him monopolize the experience points, but if there was a slightly larger group of wolves, he would order his summons to let them in. "I don't want there to be a gap in this line of defense. The centaurs can still pay the price of casualties to deal with the winter wolves, but if the mysterious boss sneaks in without anyone noticing, then it won't be a problem of running away anymore." As for the winter wolves, they were silver-tier monsters, and they were like white ghosts. These white shadows accompanied the wind and snow as they howled and shuttled through the forest. Every one of them was the size of a horse, and they were as fast as lightning. They also possessed strength that ordinary people could not hope to match. The winter wolves' strength was outstanding even among silver-tier monsters. They could easily break a black pine tree that required a person to wrap their arms around it. Human silver-tier soldiers were as weak as ordinary people in front of these terrifying monsters. For example, there was once a winter wolf that broke into the ranks of Erewhon's diplomatic party's night guards, and even under the siege of more than 10 silver-tier knights, the winter wolf bit one of them to death. However, if it was only strength, the winter wolves did not deserve to be called the ghosts of the forest that breathed frost and fog. The real terror of the winter wolves was that although they were not gold-tier monsters, they already had a part of the winter element. Their claws carried the most fatal cold damage, and as long as they lightly scratched your armor, you would be frozen into ice. Not to mention, these monsters could also spit out frost breath from dozens of feet away, freezing your blood. It could be said that the only fortunate thing about facing these monsters was that the winter wolves did not have an alpha. Legend has it that the alpha of the winter wolves was killed when fighting for the throne with Akis, the wolf calamity. Since then, the king of the forest did not allow the winter wolves to have an alpha. Every player in the Amber Sword knew that the winter wolves only had a wolf lord. It was these mini-bosses that united small wolf packs to form a real wolf pack. The winter wolves also seemed to understand their shortcomings, so these creatures that lived in ice and snow moved in at least 4 or 5 packs. 4 or 5 packs, hundreds of winter wolves, 7 or 8 lord-tier winter wolves, were considered a huge threat in any country inwound at this time of the year. Therefore, when they appeared at the periphery of the forest, a third of the 30 to 40 light pillars were extinguished in a moment. The extinguishment of the light pillars was self-evident. In the wind and snow, everyone became a little worried. The pressure in front was also increasing. The winter wolves were one of the most common threats in the northern border of Cruz, but not in the Black Forest south of Erewhon. The centaurs were not used to fighting these unfamiliar enemies, and sometimes they could only passively choose how to take the winter wolves' attacks. Therefore, the battle was bloody and tragic. However, this situation did not last for long. After Count Audine discovered the problem with the centaurs' tactics, he immediately took the initiative to look for Wade and Quinn. He said that he had some experience in fighting the winter wolves and wanted to temporarily take over the command. At this time, he did not have much time to think. It was obvious that if the centaurs, tree elves, and druids were defeated, they would not be able to survive this fierce battle. Count Audine also knew that in the whole of Erewhon, there were very few people who were good at fighting the winter wolves. Even he himself only had experience fighting the winter wolves once or twice when he was traveling in Cruz. However, things did not go as he expected. He quickly found out that there was someone who had more authority to speak about the winter wolves. It was the young man who called himself the Baron of Abes. Brando caught up from behind and took over the command without saying a word. Then, he, Scarlet, and Coden entered the front line of the battle, and it seemed that in an instant, the situation of the battle was reversed. At that moment, according to Quinn, it was as if there was a ruler in the young man's heart. Every time the winter wolves stopped, the young lord would raise his sword and order the centaur elders to stop, then throw their javelins at the white specters to inflict heavy damage to them. Every time the winter wolves stopped, the young lord would raise his sword and shout out an order for the centaur elders to stop, then throw their javelins at the white specters to deal heavy damage. Although the winter wolves' attack was outstanding, their defense inherited the weakness of wolf-type monsters. When faced with an attack from an upper silver-ranked monster, it would only take 1 or 2 attacks to kill them. After a rain of javelins, a pack of wolves would lose a quarter of its members. However, when the winter wolves charged, the centaurs were also prepared. The centaurs in the front row retreated, revealing the 2 rows of javelins at the back. It could be said that in the face of the same attack, the first move was crucial in determining the outcome of the battle. Unfortunately, the winter wolves did not have the right to make the first move in front of Brando. Brando pressed his hand on his sword and stood in the middle of the centaur army, looking at the white specters in the distance. He thought to himself that he had earned nearly 1,000,000 EXP from the winter wolves in the past. If he could not win this battle, he should go home and plant sweet potatoes. Cruz, Darwin, and the monsters around the Knight's Kingdom, Grace, and the Kingdom of Knights. He knew all of them like the back of his hand. With nearly 100 years of experience in the game, he was familiar with all of them. But in the game, this was the knowledge of all the players living in these countries. Brando's knowledge was not superior at all. But here, history was intertwined, weaving a wonderful brocade under Brando's feet. The heavily injured wolves finally retreated far away, howling maliciously in the forest. Count Audine could not believe his eyes. He did not even realize that his hand had left the hilt of his sword that he had been clenching tightly. Isn't this the standard tactic used by Cruz's White Frostfall army to deal with the winter wolves? At this moment, Count Audine almost thought of the old Cruz soldier who taught him how to deal with the winter wolves. They were both experienced, but the young man in front of him was obviously much more efficient. However, Count Audine did not know that at this time, on another mountain a few miles away, someone was sighing just like him. Cruz's men. A swordsman with a 5 to 6 feet long sword on his back stood in the dense forest on the mountain. He was wearing a grayish-brown robe and looked young, but his shoulder-length hair had already turned gray. He was looking at the battle between the centaurs and the winter wolves from afar. The man's grayish-brown eyes moved, and a trace of doubt flashed in his eyes. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 4:10. Brando didn't know what Audine was thinking. However, as time passed, he continued to command the troops to move forward. The slaughter seemed to have slowed down the passage of time. The centaur elders' armors were dyed red with blood. The blood of the winter wolves and their own blood were plated layer by layer on the shiny silver armor. Hundreds of centaurs and tree elves advanced along a long and narrow mountain stream. When they looked up, 2 intersecting mountain shadows covered half the sky. That was the Wolf Pass. Another white wave surged from the front. More than 1,000 winter wolves surged from the direction of the pass. Among the wolves, the Winter Lord raised half of its body and howled at the sky. Its snow-white mane fluttered in the wind, looking majestic. Amidst the rumbling of the earth, the wolf pack split into 3 groups. Snowflakes boiled under the wolf's claws. From the sky, it looked like a trident was charging towards the centaurs. White shadows shot into the forest on both sides, like pale ghosts leaping through the forest. The wolves opened their jaws and surrounded them in an instant. The leader of the tree elves, Quinn, raised his hand. Hundreds of tree elves drew their bows and shot. The interval between drawing an arrow, drawing the bow, aiming, and releasing the arrow was less than 2 seconds. Their movements were as fast as lightning. They were used to shooting freely, and even then, the arrows were as dense as raindrops. The winter wolves on both sides were hit by arrows and fell to the ground. However, their advantage in numbers allowed them to continue to advance, gradually threatening the flanks. They're much harder to deal with than the black wolves. Brando slashed a winter wolf pouncing towards him with his sword. He took a deep breath and exhaled a white mist. He looked up and saw that the left wing was exposed to the winter wolves. He had no choice but to raise his sword and order a company of Fireclaw lizard men to enter the fray. They charged out from the side of the forest and collided with the winter wolves. "Mr. Brando!" Quinn shouted. "Javelins!" A row of javelins flew into the air and pierced into the winter wolves in front of them. The first 3 rows of winter wolves fell to their knees, and the monsters behind them leaped over the corpses of their companions. It was like a white wave crossing a dam. The centaur and the winter wolf were like 2 waves of snow rushing towards each other in the valley, as if they were destined to collide at some point in time. But at the same time, the snow-white wolf shadows in the forest formed an attack arrow that surrounded them. Looking down from the sky, the snow-white trident was closing in on a vast area. Less than 1 li away from the wolf pass, this was the last sprint. There were more and more winter wolves in the forest, so they had to act quickly. Brando raised his head and looked at Wild. The centaur elder placed his hand on his left chest and nodded solemnly. Then, the centaur elder suddenly raised his halberd and sped up, leaping out of the centaur army. "Warriors of Naya," he cried. A row of elderly centaur guards patted their left chests and followed behind him without a change in expression. An entire row of centaur warriors raised their halberds high in the air, galloping their horses as they followed closely behind Wade. At that moment, the scene seemed to have formed a static balance in the midst of motion. The unique movement of the centaurs attracted everyone's attention. Be it their tree elves or druids, they all stared blankly as a third of the centaurs stepped out from the crowd. Under Wade's lead, they formed an independent attack arrow in front of the charging army. Count Audine was commanding Erwin's knight to rush to the right flank to protect the tree elves who were exposed to the claws of the winter wolves. But when he turned around and saw this scene, he was stunned. He was not the only one. Erwin's knight held their breaths. As soldiers, of course they knew what the centaurs were going to do next. At that moment, most of the knight raised their hands to their left chests. This was a blessing between comrades. But on the other side of the battlefield, the Winter Lord also let out a long horn, and the winter wolves flowed like a tide. Some of the winter wolves leaped out of the crowd and formed an independent attack arrow in front of the army. Their battle strategy was exactly the same as the centaurs. Huff. Sly. Under Scarlet's protection, the noblewoman who was out of breath from running stared at the winter wolves in a daze. Quinn pointed the end of his longbow in that direction and shouted, "Open a path for our glorious companions." The tree elves immediately gave up on the flanks and drew their bows again. This was the first time the tree elves had shot in unison since they entered the battlefield. The huge elven longbows were drawn to a full moon, and creaking sounds could be heard. Arrow of life. Strong wind, east. 200 feet, 150 feet, fire. The archers released their bowstrings in unison, and everyone seemed to hear a soft buzzing sound at the same time. A black shadow covered the sky and covered the earth, like a flock of migratory birds flying high into the sky. The arrows flew to the highest point in the sky and swooped down like a bird of prey. The rain of arrows fell on the heads of the winter wolves as if the grim reaper waved his scythe, and countless winter wolves fell to the ground. In an instant, the lone arrow of the winter wolves was nailed to the ground like a porcupine. Then, the winter wolves at the back leaped over the corpses that had turned into statues. They no longer had the time to change their formation because the centaurs had formed a straight line and were about to collide with them. A dull sound of collision could be heard from the battlefield. In an instant, the white wave and the silver line formed by the centaurs collided. Most of the centaurs immediately fell to the ground and were swallowed by the white wave. The silver line only existed for a moment before disintegrating. But at least the flood of winter wolves was stopped for a moment. The white wave of snow stagnated. Then, they realized that Brando's army was charging towards them. The centaurs were not afraid at all. Instead, they sped up. Brando raised his sword and shouted, "Assault formation." He took the lead. With him as the center, the tip of the arrow became sharp. The army was charging forward. At the same time, Quinn pointed his longbow behind him and shouted, "Warriors of the forest, stop the enemy." Whoosh! Vines emerged from the mud and stone slabs of the valley, blocking the rear of the army. The tree elves at the back threw away their longbows and turned around, unsheathing the long swords on their backs. They turned around, stopped, and separated themselves from the army, forming a thin line of defense. The winter wolves at the flanks immediately realized that there was a human wall in front of them. 20 feet. The enemy was close. Brando gripped Halran Gaia with both hands as he charged forward. He could see every strand of white hair on their bodies trembling in the cold wind. Less than half of the 100 centaurs that Wade had led were left. The centaur elder charged into the winter wolves alone. With a flash of his halberd, a winter wolf was sent flying. Brando saw all of this. He took a deep breath and raised Halran Gaia. Come, the blood of a warrior. Brando had not felt the blood in his body boiling and rushing to his brain for a long time. It was this feeling that made him persevere on this path. The path of a warrior. That's why I say, to charge forward without hesitation. Brando closed his eyes, then opened them again. This is the romance of a warrior. The moment he opened his eyes, he activated charge. At the same time, he swung Halran Gaia in front of him, and a white light flashed parallel to him. In the eyes of outsiders, Brendel was one man and one sword, charging into the pack of wolves with a flash of white light. Wherever the sword passed, armor flattened, flesh and blood splattered. It was as if a silver line had been drawn into the winter wolves. With this silver line as the center, the winter wolves parted to the sides. They did not take the initiative, but rather, they parted with a rain of blood. Because of the speed, the power of Halran Gaia only exploded after the man and the sword had passed. It looked as if the ground behind Brando was cracking. As soon as Brendel passed by, there was a rumbling sound of sharp rocks piercing the sky behind him. A gap appeared in the winter wolves' defense. Brando and Widd passed by each other. A winter wolf that had pounced on the centaur elder was immediately split into two. Its large head flew high with a rain of blood. Widd looked up and saw Brando's back. The centaur elder shook off the blood on his halberd and snorted softly. Behind Brando, the centaur army, led by Scarlet and Coden, pierced into the gap like a wedge. Under the huge impact, even the winter wolves could not resist. Without the momentum, they could only retreat. Ropar's Fireclaw lizards and Audine's knight entered from the left and right flanks respectively. The gap in the center of the winter wolves was finally torn open. Brando swung his sword forward, and a white wind blew away several winter wolves. He looked up and realized that he had killed a winter wolf. There was a clear path ahead. They're here. Brando took a deep breath. He looked back and saw Coden and Scarlet leading the centaurs from the left and right. Then came the tree elves, followed by Erwin's knight and Ropar's Fireclaw lizards. But when he looked behind him, his eyes suddenly narrowed. Widd and his centaur vanguard had not caught up. The centaur elder raised his halberd and signaled for the remaining centaurs to move closer to him. The centaurs once again formed a human wall. They were covering the rear with their own lives. Widd. Brando was shocked. This was not his original plan. But the centaur elder only looked back and raised his hand to make a gesture. Almost no one understood the gesture, but Brando and Quinn understood. It was the common language of the forest citizens. We are the children of the forest. At that moment, Brando suddenly held his breath and closed his eyes. P.S. So today I'm putting up 3 chapters. There's still 1 chapter left. Hoo-hoo-hoo, it's so painful to pay off debts. I'm rolling on the ground. To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 411. The winter wolves that had been beaten into a daze were regrouping in front of the centaurs. Like a wave of snow, they would soon gather and swarm over, mercilessly swallowing Wade and his subordinates. Amandina, Coden, and Quinn all turned to look at the direction of the winter wolves. Austin did the same not far away. There were only a few knights of Erewhon and nobles left behind, but none of them could make a sound. Once upon a time, Erewhon had the spirit to pursue such a belief. Count Austin subconsciously tightened his grip on the sword in his hand. He turned around and said to Dolent. "Count Dolent, I'll leave the envoy group to you." He didn't know if Dolent was blessed by the heavens or he was just too lucky to be able to hold on until now. "Me?" Dolent was taken aback. "Count Austin, what are you trying to do?" Austin turned back with an expressionless face. For the first time, his eyes burned with something that had never been there before. He pointed his shining sword forward and shouted, "Knights of Erewhon. One day, will you watch your comrades fight alone and die on the battlefield?" The knight was slightly stunned. They looked at their commander and subconsciously took a deep breath. "No, we won't." "Because the lion's flag flies high," Austin shouted, "the belief of the past has never faded." He turned to look at the knight. "Follow me, you are the sharp swords of Erewhon." Austin turned back and charged into the battlefield. The knight shouted, "Swear on the sword," and the Green Knight charged into the winter wolves. They were Erewhon's knights. Dolent was stunned. He looked at the scene in a daze and did not even say a word to stop them. He was not the only one who was taken aback, even Brendel was taken aback. But when he looked at these people, he suddenly felt a lump in his throat. This was Erewhon's belief. Even if it was deeply corrupted, it still shone with a light that people yearned for in the darkness. This was the meaning of so many people fighting for it. This was also the reason why countless players loved this land. Many people wrote such words on the forum: "We are not strong, but we love it." At this moment, Brandos suddenly remembered the meaning of the name of this country. In the glorious past, Yak named this land Erewhon in order to wish for miracles. If he didn't believe in miracles, then Erewhon wouldn't have any reason to exist. He suddenly felt that he couldn't say a word. He simply raised the Halran Gaia in his hand. "Ropar, bring up the rear." The Fireclaw Lizard Man Lord withdrew his gaze from the humans and centaurs. He then bowed deeply to Brando and spoke for the first time in days. "The true essence of war lies in honoring a warrior's honor. As for what we fight for, that is of great significance to our Fireclaw clan." The Fireclaw Lizard Man Lord lowered his head and said, "But no matter what, pursuing one's faith is an incomparably glorious thing." It raised its head. "So thank you, Master, for giving us such an opportunity to fight side by side with such a group of people. The Fireclaw clan will not disappoint you." Ropar waved his hand and the Fireclaw Lizard men entered the battlefield. Brando turned around. "Let's continue forward," he said softly to Quinn. After passing through the last wolf pack, they had passed through the first layer of the loop of trade winds. Next was the storm circle. The tree elf leader didn't say a word from beginning to end. He only nodded silently. The group continued forward. After passing through the last line of defense of the winter wolves, the wolves in front of them finally became sparse. In the remaining time, after experiencing several small-scale battles, the remaining people finally crossed the Wolf's Pass. The Wolf Pass was the desperate situation of the calamity of wolves. After passing through the pass formed by the two towering peaks of the Kalanga Mountains, they entered the inner region of the Loop of Trade Winds. This was the so-called Storm Circle. Only after passing through the Wall of Storms would they be considered to have entered the core region of the Loop of Trade Winds. The Storm Circle would not produce the calamity of wolves, but there were more powerful monsters lurking within. This was no longer a suitable place for a large group to advance. In other words, the centaurs and druids had completed their mission at this point. However, the group that started with hundreds of people was now left with only 100 or 200 people. Even the youths under his command had lost more than a third, and this was the result under the protection of Coden and Scarlet. Among the 6 youths, one of them had died, while the other was heavily injured. This was their first battle, and the result was cruel. Not to mention that many of them had also lost their lives for this. Count Audine, Wade, the Eruin Knight and the Centaurs. At this time, Brando could not help but look back at the mountain stream that they had passed through. In that direction, a pale green pillar of light flashed in the dark sky and finally disappeared. Everything returned to darkness. Seeing this scene, Brando did not say anything, but he felt an inexplicable sense of loss. Although he knew that many people would lose their lives in the face of the calamity of wolves, when it really happened, Brando found that he was not prepared. He thought that after going through so much, his heart would have long been made of stone. He turned his head and saw Amandina's bright eyes looking at him. Brando was slightly stunned. He did not know what this Amandina was thinking. Was she disappointed? In his eyes, Amandina's requirements for him were quite strict, or perhaps it should be said that she had high expectations. This noble girl always seemed to want to see a more perfect side of him. A perfect lord. But Brando believed that he would never be able to achieve this. He was himself, and besides the greed in his heart, he could be considered as an ordinary person. Compared to those monstrous geniuses who had every step under their control, perhaps he looked more like a guy with good luck. Even in the past, he wasn't the best player, nor was he the strongest warrior, was he? Brando blinked and sighed. But the noble girl seemed to be keenly aware of his thoughts. She looked at him and said softly, "I think, in fact, there are some things that do not have a correct answer, my lord." Brando was slightly stunned. He looked at Amandina. This did not sound like something this noble girl would say. "I used to be strict with myself," Amandina only smiled at Brando, her lord, "but I think, if you do not feel regret for something all the time, then it would be scary. Because no matter what, people can't be detached from their own feelings. I think this is the nature of humans," she smiled, "but it is because of this or that dissatisfaction with ourselves that we can surpass ourselves. That's why I feel more at ease when I'm with such a real lord." "You?" Brando blushed. "You know what I think." Amandina put her hands behind her back and nodded lightly. "In the end, my lord and I are the same kind of people." Brando coughed and turned around. He saw Quinn nodding at him not far away. "Lord Brando," the tree elf leader said, "life is precious, so this kind of sacrifice is worthy of respect." Brando raised his head and looked at the flashing pillars of light in the forest. He suddenly said, "There are so many people here who hold the flame of civilization in their hands. But how many people are there who are truly fighting for justice?" He looked at Quinn and said, "In the end, I only allied with you to borrow your strength. There is no such thing as a person with a pure heart, Lord Brando," Quinn replied as he looked around vigilantly. "Can I ask you a question?" "What is it?" "Lord Brando, if you achieve your goal, and you only need to pay a small price to make the outcome better, such as saving the Green Tower, will you do it?" "Why not?" Brando asked. Quinn turned around and smiled. He then spoke in the ethereal language of the elves. "So, do you still not understand, Lord Brando? Kindness in your heart doesn't need to be said, but it is already the most precious thing in the world. That's why I said it before. If you are Lord Brando, I think you can become an ally of the people of the forest." Brando was slightly startled. He took a deep breath and nodded. But Scarlet, who had been silent all this while, suddenly asked, "Most people would think this way." "If it's effortless," Quinn turned around and looked at her. He paused for a moment before speaking. "If it's not the wish of most people, how can there be a civilized world?" "What do you mean?" Scarlet was puzzled. "If there's no such thing as kindness, we won't speak. Without words, we won't need to communicate," Quinn replied. He looked up as if he suddenly thought of Wild. They had fought side by side for many years. Even though they often joked about who would die first, he didn't expect this day to come so suddenly. The tree elf took a deep breath. Without spiritual communication, what's the difference between humans and beasts? Scarlet was stunned. Everyone else fell silent. Suddenly, a clear voice came from the nearby forest. The difference between humans and beasts is that they are afraid of fire, but we yearn for light. The fire of civilization burns brightly in the wilderness. It illuminates not only the chaos, but also the human heart. But for thousands of years, the descendants of the Flame King seem to have forgotten this. Following this voice, a man carrying a two-handed greatsword that was taller than a man slowly walked out from the forest. He stopped in front of Brando and looked up at them. The man raised his head and looked at everyone. That pair of strange gray eyes seemed to be dim, but it made everyone's heart skip a beat. They felt as if they were being locked on by the other party's aura at the same time. Who is this guy? Coden, Scarlet, and Quinn raised their weapons. A strong man suddenly appeared in the wilderness and blocked their path. No matter how they looked at it, it was more like an enemy than a friend. But Brando was the only one who didn't move. Because he was looking at this guy with a face full of disbelief. The Ash Sword Saint, Mephisto. Author's Note, Chapter 2, Ash Sword Saint. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 4:12. In the whole of Wonde, there were a lot of famous legendary figures that the players were familiar with. Some of them were famous sword saints, such as Veronica, who was known as the goddess of war, or Darius, the earth sword saint who could split a mountain with his sword. Even Bugha, who was unknown in this era, would become a famous sword master in the future. There were also legendary wizards, such as Tolman of the Silver Castle, William of the Scroll King, Kira the Iron Smelter. There were also talented generals, such as Black Lord and Surshta, Falcon Nicholas, Long Blade Lord Harrison, and Valkyrie Freya. But among these people, none of them were as respected as Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles. There was no other reason. As the only person in Wonde who dared to declare war on an entire empire, this courage alone was enough to win the hearts of everyone. Brando remembered that it was almost 30 years ago. At that time, the insufferably arrogant crews completely destroyed the resistance of a small country called the Duchy of Sutherland after a series of victories. As usual, this small country on the border was incorporated into the territory of the empire. In the history of Cruz's 1,000 years of war, this was just a small point that should have been unremarkable. But this time, the Eagle Empire encountered an enemy that gave them a headache. In the Whistling Year, Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles appeared in the vision of Cruz. The first time he appeared was during the Battle of Cruz's royal city, where he single-handedly tried to assassinate the Emperor of the Empire. Of course, he didn't succeed. But in this battle, Mephistopheles single-handedly destroyed an entire battalion of Cruz's royal guards, a battalion of the border guards, and 2 squadrons of the royal city guards. 3 viscounts, 1 earl, more than 20 lieutenants, and 3 times the number of reserve officers of the Empire's officer academy died in the hands of this Ash Sword Saint. If the loss of 3 viscounts and 1 count was only a humiliation to the Empire, then the loss of the 2 companies of reserve officers truly infuriated the sovereign of the Empire at that time. The reserve officers of the King's City Garrison Guard were undoubtedly the elites of the Empire. They were the future pillars of the Empire. Who would have thought that 2 squadrons of them would be wiped out by Mephisto? Even for someone as wealthy as Cruz, he would feel the pinch. However, what happened next was beyond everyone's expectations. In a fit of rage, the Empire sent out the most powerful capture team in history. The commanders of the 4 major armies, the president of the Imperial Alchemist Association, and even 3 Imperial sorcerers from the Tower of Stars and Moon. As for how strong this formation was, one only needed to know that Veronica, the leader of Azure Firmament, was the most junior member of the team. One could imagine what kind of old monsters this team was made up of. However, it was this formation that allowed Mephisto to escape with serious injuries. This incident not only made the Kurlutzians lose face, it could be said that it was a slap in the face of the Kurlutzians who had been insufferably arrogant for centuries, but it also set off a brazen wave in all of Vaunt. After that, the Temple of the Wind Empress and the Templar Church tried to find Mephistopheles, trying to use his hatred for Kurlutz to make him join their forces. Unfortunately, since then, this guy seemed to have disappeared and no one had seen him again. There were rumors that he died from his injuries. Of course, Brando knew that this was just a joke. After all, Mephisto had a rather important quest line. The players of the Amber Sword couldn't be more familiar with this pervert. What Brando didn't expect was that this guy would appear here in advance. The next time he appeared in history was almost 5 years later. Therefore, the moment he saw Mephisto, there was only one thought in his mind: is the Lionheart so attractive that even this old pervert is here? Brando stared at the man in front of him with his mouth agape. He felt that if he could stare at the man in front of him, he would have done so long ago. At this moment, Mephisto was wearing a grey robe with a cloak and a sword on his back. Of course, the most distinguishing feature of his was his long grey hair and grey eyes. It could be said that there was no other human in the world with such unique hair and eye color. This was because Mephisto's hair and eye color were affected by his element. Greysword Saint Mephistopheles' element was the Song of Grey. It was a strange element, but if you really fought him, you wouldn't think so. In the past, Brando had only fought Mephisto once. That was when he completed the Black Iron Body quest. The goal of the quest was simple: to last 10 seconds under Mephisto's attacks. Brando remembered that during his first quest, he had used all the buffs he could drink and eat. Then, he was instantly sent back to the resurrection altar in 3 moves. This wasn't because of level suppression. To be honest, Mephisto was only level 70 or 80 at his peak, but his swordsmanship was terrifying. The Sword Saint of Grey was only a title of Mephisto's, but in reality, many players believed that Mephisto was the only NPC who had trained his basic swordsmanship to level 25 and above. Although this rumor wasn't credible, it was enough to show that this guy's swordsmanship was terrifying. It was even beyond the limits of strength. Brando looked at Mephisto, his mind racing. Although he didn't know much about Mephisto's personality, he knew that this guy was definitely not someone with a good temper. Just look at the things he did. Was this person standing in front of them an enemy? Or a friend? It was hard to say. But what made him frown was that Mephisto had a good impression of Erewhon in history. He also didn't have any entanglements with the Druids. Logically speaking, he shouldn't be an enemy. But he wasn't an enemy. Brando looked at Greysword Saint Mephistopheles, who was standing in the middle of their path. He felt that his reasoning was somewhat unreliable. But at least he knew that in front of such a powerful existence, his judgment didn't have much meaning. It all depended on the other party's mood. Therefore, Brando didn't say anything and didn't do anything to avoid angering this guy. He just raised his head and looked at the other party. The scene was silent for a few seconds. While Brando was sizing up Mephisto, the Sword Saint was also sizing them up. His eyes first swept over the few remaining Erewhon nobles, then fell on Brando. Crew's people. Mephisto stretched out his hand, and the great sword on his back flew out and landed in his hand. Then he pointed the tip of the sword at Brando and asked. Brando was startled. He looked at Mephisto dumbfoundedly. At that moment, it was as if he heard the sound of heaven and earth shattering. Brando only felt cold sweat on his back. What kind of joke is this? Holy shit, Brando thought to himself. Kurlutz. I'm a popular Tauren. But if this guy thinks I'm a cruise person, according to the other party's habits, I'll be cut in half immediately. Of course, Brando didn't want to die without knowing why, so he quickly shook his head. No, no, he replied. Sir, I think you've got the wrong person. I'm a Erewhon person. Erewhon person. Mephisto looked at Brando and replied, It looks like it, but Erewhon people don't know the tactics of the Falling Frost Army. Tell me, are you a member of the Falling Frost Army? Brando realized that it was his tactic of letting the centaurs use the Falling Frost Army to fight against the winter wolves that attracted this monster. At this moment, he felt even more wrong than Do-E. In the past, not to mention the players of Erewhon, even the players of Madara knew this tactic. It was nothing more than a test of experience. There was nothing technical about it. As long as one looked at a video on the internet, it would be clear at a glance. But there was no way to explain this, so Brando could only think of a way to quibble. Sir, there are many people who know that tactic. After all, tactics are dead, but people are alive. It's not only Erewhon people who know how to deal with the winter wolves, right? Brando felt that although his excuse was clumsy, there were no loopholes. The truth was that even in this world, there were many people who knew the tactics of the Falling Frost Army. This was not a secret to begin with. For example, Count Audine knew it. But he did not expect Mephisto to not be swayed at all. On the contrary, the Sword Saint smiled slightly with an expression that said, Everything is under my control, don't try to quibble. Then he looked at Brando and said, Indeed, it's possible to use this tactic more skillfully than the commander of the Falling Frost Army. Young man, you're the first person I've seen who can use this tactic. As far as I know, he said again, it seems that other than Cruz, Erewhon doesn't suffer from the winter wolves, right? Ha! At that moment, Brando felt as if a bolt from the blue had struck his head. There was only one voice echoing in his heart, natural idiocy is the cause of death. I'm innocent. Brando felt like crying at this moment. He did not expect that the tactic that he had repeatedly practiced in the game to deal with the winter wolves in order to gain experience would be fatal at this moment. But it seemed that this was the truth. According to Mephisto's way of understanding, Brando soon realized that he really did not have a way to explain it clearly. Indeed, how could he explain the fact that a person from Erewhon could use the tactic so skillfully against the winter wolves? Not to mention that this was something that did not make sense in itself. More importantly, even if a person from Erewhon wanted to practice, as Mephisto said, he had to have a place to practice, right? Brando could not help but rub his hands together. His expression suddenly became a little strange. In fact, he had always thought that his experience was a great cheat, but he did not expect that one day this cheat would finally bring him great trouble. Lady Martha, do you have to be like this? You're not playing with me, right? The young lord looked at Mephistopheles with a strange expression on his face and sighed miserably in his heart. I'm telling the truth, Mephistopheles, boss Mephistopheles, can you not be like this? I can explain. P.S. Alright, actually this is the third update. Try to pay off your debt by tomorrow. If I'm loving enough, I'll give you a little dessert the day after tomorrow. Chapter 4:14. Brando's mind raced. In fact, he had a lot of things that could prove his identity, but the most convincing one was the White Raven sword art and the brooch given to him by the princess. The White Raven sword art was the secret sword art of Erewhon's palace. Anyone who saw it would suspect that he was related to the royal family of Erewhon. The White Raven sword art was derived from the Holy Cathedral of the Wind Empress, so it had nothing to do with Cruz. The brooch was the symbol of the Royal Knight Order of Erewhon. Even if the Cruz people had a way to get it, they would not use it as a disguise. Even the weak Erewhon would not accept such humiliation. As the saying goes, a rabbit will bite when cornered. Although the Cruz people were not afraid of Erewhon's strength, they would not want to get involved in a war for no reason. It could be said that the high-ranking nobles of the Cruz people would not bother to disguise themselves as Erewhon people. If the other Cruz people chose to do so, they would have to consider the consequences. Although the Cruz people were protective of their own people, they would not get involved in a war for a nobody. Therefore, whether it was the White Raven sword art or the emblem of the Royal Knight Order, they were the best evidence to prove that he was one of Erwin's people. However, Brando hesitated for a while and decided to use the White Raven sword art to prove himself. After all, the brooch was a secret agreement between him and the princess. Brando could guess from the history and the princess letter that the nobles who supported the royal family of Corvado were not united. Although there were loyal subjects like Oberway and Benninger, there were also people like Woods and Makarov who were wavering in the middle. Not to mention the people under Duke Anthony who had their own plans. It was not hard to imagine that not everyone wanted the princess to get in touch with him. Some of them might even try to stop her. Even though Brendel did not know that he had already guessed the situation, he had a rough idea in his heart. He could imagine that Her Royal Highness had given this brooch to him despite all the pressure she was under. In fact, it was a sign of trust. This kind of insignificant support did not have any practical meaning, but it gave Brando a sense of trust. As a modern person, Brando could not have the feeling of a knight swearing loyalty to the king, but at least he felt a faint sense of satisfaction in his heart. Brando did not know what this feeling was. But he knew that if he casually used this kind of trust, it would put the princess thousands of miles away in a disadvantageous position. Even though this had nothing to do with him, he subconsciously chose to avoid this option. Mr. Mephisto. Brando took a deep breath and put away the feeling of being inexplicably pointed out by Mephisto. He said seriously, "I think you're mistaken about one thing." "Oh, you know me." Mephisto snorted softly. He looked at Brando coldly and said, "But it's useless to say more." "Where is Veronica?" Brando was stunned. Mephisto was looking for trouble with Veronica. He must have heard from somewhere that Veronica had left Cruz alone, so he came all the way here. Brando was secretly shocked. Mephisto had spent a lot of effort to catch up with Veronica. There were no less than 10 sea and land routes from Cruz to Erewhon. After entering the Black Forest, there was no trace of Veronica. How much hatred did Mephisto have for people from Cruz to do this? But there was one thing that made him speechless. Where was he going to find Veronica? Speaking of which, he had lost the precious daughter of the Duke of Cruz, a genius alchemist, and a Viscount of the Empire. It was too late to hide, so why would he go looking for her? Was he looking for death? Greysword St. Mephistopheles was not surprised by Brando's reaction. Although he hated people from Cruz, he knew that most people from Cruz, especially nobles, were extremely proud and unyielding. They rarely backed down because of threats. Years ago, when Mephisto fought against the army in Cruz, most of the candidates who died in his hands were young. But even though they knew that they were no match for him, none of them fell with their backs facing him. That battle left a deep impression on Mephisto. Therefore, when he saw Brando today, he did not intend to let him speak first. The Ash Sword Saint snorted coldly, "You don't want to talk? Then come with me. I believe Veronica will not leave a future genius like you alone." Although he did not see Brando's swordsmanship, the young man's commanding ability when fighting against the Winter Wolf was enough to be called a genius. "Wait." Brando saw the Ash Sword Saint raise his giant sword without saying anything. His gray cloak fluttered, and an invisible wind pressure came at him. He was going to attack directly. Brando could not help but feel his scalp tingle. His eyes narrowed, and he quickly slid back like a ghost. Mephisto raised his sword to block Brando's escape route. With his ability, he could easily capture Brando among these people. But he did not expect Brando to retreat so quickly. It was as if he knew what he was going to do. At this time, Brando secretly sighed. When the Ash Sword Saint attacked, his in-depth analysis skill did not react at all. In the game, this could only mean one thing: the Ash Sword Saint's skill level was too high. It had exceeded the limit of the current in-depth analysis skill. However, in-depth analysis could more or less play a role in the fight with Veronica. Although the Kurlutzian sword saint did not use her full strength, the difference in strength between the two was obvious. In fact, Brando knew very well that the Ash Sword Saint might be slightly weaker than the Green Sword Saint Veronica in terms of absolute strength. But if they really fought, Veronica might not be a match for the Ash Sword Saint. Veronica's swordsmanship was at the peak of perfection. She could be considered as one of the top sword saints. However, the Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles was already an inhuman existence in the hearts of the players. If one had to give him a title, it would be the Sword God. Brando was able to dodge the attack purely because he had studied the Ash Sword Saint's attacking habits more than once when he completed the Black Iron Body quest. Moreover, he knew that the Ash Sword Saint would not defend himself if he wanted to capture him. With his experience and cleverness, he was able to dodge the attack before the Ash Sword Saint made his move. Otherwise, if the Ash Sword Saint was determined to slash Brando, not to mention his swordsmanship, just his sword aura alone would be enough to split Brando into two. Even so, he was only able to take one step back. After that, he would not be able to dodge the Ash Sword Saint's second strike. It was as if he knew what the Ash Sword Saint was going to do next. But his strength was limited, and the gap between them was too big. Even if he knew what the Ash Sword Saint was going to do next, he could only watch as he was defeated. He took a step back and looked up to see Mephistopheles' calm expression. Mephistopheles swung his sword in the direction of his right hand, and a crescent-shaped sword aura shot out. But the strange thing was that the sword aura drew a perfect arc on the ground and whooshed towards Brendel's back as if it had eyes of its own. Secret Art. Dragon Strike. In the past, countless players had died under this attack. Of course, Brando was no exception. Even after reaching level 130 as a warrior, he still could not master this technique. Forget about mastering it, he had never even heard of it. Other than the Ash Sword Saint's self-created secret art, the 20 forms, no one else knew this technique. Brando saw that the Ash Sword Saint was going to use his ultimate attack, but he could not do anything about it. At least, Brando did not think that he was tired of living. He could only stop for a moment. But the moment he stopped, the result was already decided. Mephistopheles seemed to have predicted Brendel's choice. He retracted his great sword, and with a sudden thrust, he charged towards Brendel. Brendel swallowed the word "wait" back into his stomach. The young lord felt a sense of suffocation in the face of such a powerful attack. This was the Ash Sword Saint's plan. In his opinion, Brando could only raise his sword to meet the Ash Sword Saint's attack. And in a battle where the weak was fighting against the strong, the Ash Sword Saint could not do anything. If the Ash Sword Saint was still suppressing the Ash Sword Saint, then the next attack would be the key to victory. Brendel was aware of this, but he had no other choice. His mind raced as he tried to find a way to resolve the worst-case scenario. It was at this moment that a voice that he was extremely familiar with suddenly sighed. It was the voice of the female knight. The Ash Sword Saint's aura made her feel threatened in her sleep, so she woke up early. As soon as she woke up, she immediately realized that Brando was in a very dangerous situation. "I've never seen his swordsmanship before, but he's pretty strong," Orthlis said as she stretched lazily. She saw Mephisto's sword coming towards her, and because of the quick exchange of thoughts, she was able to ask calmly, "Little guy, how did you manage to get into trouble over there? Is this my own fault?" Brendel thought to himself. Is this my own fault? This was obviously his own trouble. Not only was the Ash Sword Saint a natural airhead, he was also a one-track mind. He did not even give Brendel a chance to speak before attacking. Is there still any justice in this world? However, Brando was not in the mood to pay attention to Orthlis's teasing. The great sword was about to pierce his chest, and he had no choice but to use Halran Gaia to parry. P.S. I wrote 3 chapters today, but I'll release 2 chapters first. It's too scary to not have any chapters. I'll make up for it in the next 1 or 2 days. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 4:15. In fact, Brando wanted to use the White Raven sword art to prove himself, but he was powerless to do so. He could not help but feel powerless. Greysword Saint Mephistopheles was as terrifying as ever. He did not even give him a chance to fight back. Let's not talk about using the White Raven sword style. If I make any unnecessary movements, I'll probably be killed by her sword. Although Mephistopheles was determined to capture him alive, a battle of swordsmanship was not a joke. Both parties knew that the other party would go all out. If one of them tried to play around, he would be killed by the other party. That was not within Mephistopheles' expectations. After all, who would have thought that an opponent who was fighting with his life would play around with his own? Mephistopheles knew that Brando would have to use all his strength to block his attacks. That was the only way to limit the young man's movements. In fact, Brando had already surprised Mephistopheles. He was sure that this young man was a genius, and not just any genius. It was not that he was arrogant, but he had never seen a young man who could withstand 3 of his attacks. Not to mention a young man, even a grand swordsman who had been famous for a long time might not be able to withstand 3 of his attacks. After a round of battle, Mephistopheles had a rough idea of Brando's strength. But the more he thought about it, the more he was sure that Veronica would not give up on this young man so easily. Even in the Cruz Empire, it was rare for a young man in his early 20s to possess the strength of a gold. Moreover, he was also a genius in swordsmanship and battle tactics. Even Mephistopheles was secretly interested in this young man. But it was a pity that he was from the Cruz Empire. The genius of the Cruz Empire was his enemy. Mephistopheles' face was cold, but his sword moved faster. At this time, Brando heard Orthless yawn sleepily and said, "Quick, little guy. Give me the control of this body. You can't defeat this guy. Is it okay?" Brando's mind was as fast as lightning. "There's a bit of a problem. You're definitely much weaker than him, but at least you're not completely helpless. I mean, is it okay to force it? Lady Orthless, didn't you say that this is not the correct way to use the Holy Seal?" "Of course. I've rested for a month or 2 since the last time. 10 minutes or so shouldn't be a problem." Orthless replied proudly, "What, are you looking down on me?" "That's not it, Lady Orthless," Brando replied. After all, they were in the prime material plane. But when he thought about how Orthless had saved his life in Butchie, he felt relieved. "You can do it." The exchange of thoughts between the two was completed in an instant. Mephisto's greatsword had just collided with Brando's Halran Gaia. But in reality, Brando was no longer in control of his body. In that instant, Orthless struck out 3 times in a row. Halran Gaia turned into a black shadow in her hand. Due to its speed, it looked like Halran Gaia had split into 3 and collided with Mephisto's greatsword at the same time. Ding! The 3 sword strikes turned into a single metallic sound. Then, Orthless took advantage of the momentum and retreated out of the range of the Ash Sword Saint's attack without taking any damage. At this time, only a few seconds had passed since the start of the fight. There was a deathly stillness in the vicinity. The youths were dumbfounded, let alone the nobles from Erwin's diplomatic party. They seemed to have only just realized what they had seen. Was that young man really one of Erwin's men? Were the 2 of them still using mortal swordsmanship? Although the nobles were unbearable, they still had some ability to join the diplomatic party. Especially Robert, who was born in a prominent family, was naturally knowledgeable. He took a deep breath and immediately realized something. That young man was probably the most outstanding genius of Erewhon in the last 3 centuries. He couldn't let him die in the hands of someone of unknown origin. Although Brando had called out the name of the Greysword Saint Mephistopheles, there were many people with the same name in this world. Furthermore, the Ash Sword Saint had disappeared for so many years that it was normal for Robert to not recognize him. But at this moment, he suddenly ran out and shouted, "Sir, wait, he's not Crew." He wanted to prove that Brando wasn't one of Crew's men, but before he could finish his sentence, the Sword Saint who had rested his great sword on his shoulder interrupted him. Greysword Saint Mephistopheles raised his eyebrows and looked at Brando with interest. He didn't even look at the fat Robert who was yelling at the side. Instead, he interrupted him and said to Brando, "What a good flash strike sword art, descendant of Gretel. Young man, Crew's secret swordsmanship is now in your hands. What else do you have to say?" The jaws of Erewhon's diplomatic party dropped to the ground when they heard Brendel's words. Robert stared at the young man with his mouth agape. His mind went blank for a moment. Crew's secret swordsmanship, flash strike sword art, was passed down from the Dragon clan. It was much more famous than Erewhon's White Raven swordsmanship, which was modified from the Wind Elf sword art. The White Raven swordsmanship might have been lost to the outside world, but flash strike sword art could only be practiced by Gretel's direct descendants. It was the Flame King's swordsmanship, one of the pride of the Eagle Empire. Greysword Saint Mephistopheles and even the fat Erewhon noble who fought alongside Brando from the Calamity of Wolves couldn't help but wonder if this young noble was really one of Crew's men. Brando looked more like Erewhon's men. But in fact, except for the blonde hair and blue eyes of the pure-blooded Eagle Knight's descendants, most Crew's men and Erewhon's men were very similar. After all, both of them were born from the same race centuries ago. Not to mention that Brando's mother was from Caliga, and his ancestors were exiled nobles from Crew's. Therefore, it was hard for him to tell the difference. At this moment, Robert suddenly realized something. No wonder this young man dared to teach the little princess of Flower Leaf a lesson so mercilessly. No wonder he dared to talk back to Veronica. No wonder he didn't put the lion beast men in his eyes. This young man was originally from Crew's, and not just any ordinary Crew's men. He knew flash strike sword art, which meant that he was a direct descendant of the Flame King, Gretel. Crew's was not like Erewhon, where the Corvado dynasty replaced the Cipher dynasty. Because of the support of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, it was natural for the descendants of the Flame King to rule the empire. In summary. In other words, this young man was not only from Crew's, but also from the royal family of Crew's. When he thought of how they dared to provoke a member of the royal family of Crew's, Robert could not help but raise his chubby hand to wipe the sweat off his forehead. He paused for a moment and said hesitantly to Brando, "Sir Baron, please forgive us. We shouldn't have offended you." He did not dare to directly say that Brando was from Crew's to avoid the wrath of Mephisto. But in his opinion, Mephisto had already recognized Brando's identity, so it made no difference whether he said it or not. But as soon as he spoke, Worthless glanced at him in confusion. At this moment, Brando, who had just returned his soul to his body, almost vomited blood. Damn it, this time he would not be able to clear his name even if he jumped into the Yellow River. "Lady Orthless," he could not help but say, "You, what?" Orthless was slightly stunned. She was not an idiot. When she heard Mephisto's strange question and saw Robert's suspicious attitude, she naturally understood that she had done something stupid. But what she could not understand was that the Flame King Gretel's swordsmanship was a sage's swordsmanship. Could it be that the descendants of the Flame King had fallen to the point where everyone wanted to beat them up? But that did not seem to be the case. "Aren't you a wind elf? Why do you know how to use flash strike sword art?" Brando asked weakly. Normally, people would use the swordsmanship they are most familiar with, right? That's true, Orthless replied, but boy, this is your body now. Most of the swordsmanship I've trained in is suitable for females, and guild swordsmanship is most suitable for you. That's why you can unleash 100% of its power. In that situation just now, I could only use my full strength to protect myself, she replied in her mind. Also, didn't you use Flash Strike sword art last time in the Arena of Destiny? Brando almost vomited blood again. He thought that Orthless was an unexpected savior, but he did not know that this was the worst decision he had ever made. This was the worst decision he had ever made. But he also knew that the knight herself was not at fault. It was just that he could not think of such a coincidence even if he racked his brains. This is too much of a coincidence. But there was no point in saying anything now. Even Erwin's envoy had begun to doubt his identity. The centaurs and tree elves naturally did not have the ability to prove his identity. Only Coden, Amandina, and Scarlet knew that he was telling the truth. They had seen him use Flash Strike sword art in the underworld. But then again, could Coden, Amandina, and Scarlet really be sure? Brando knew that in their hearts, he was also a mystery. Moreover, even if the two ladies were willing to testify, Greysword Saint Mephistopheles might not necessarily believe them. After all, in the eyes of this sword saint, they were on the same side as him. Brando glanced over. Scarlet seemed to want to walk over, but she was pulled back by Amandina. This action made Brando breathe a sigh of relief. He was really afraid that Scarlet would act rashly. Mephistopheles did not kill him because he still had some use for him. He might not be merciful to others. In fact, at this time, Brando understood that there was only one way left to prove his identity. And that was the silver brooch of the princess. A real member of the royal family of Cruz would not disguise himself as a knight of the royal family of Erwin. However, it was obviously not appropriate to display the silver brooch of the princess here. Brando looked around and said to Orthless, "Lady Orthless, do you have any tricks that can increase my speed?" "Of course, why?" Orthless replied while keeping her guard up against Mephistopheles. "Think of a way to lure him away from here. Lure him to a place where there's no one." Brando replied. "Boy, you're being too whimsical." Orthless shook her head. "His absolute strength is far greater than yours. I can only rely on my skills to make up for it for a while. There's no way I can escape, that's enough." "Greysword Saint Mephistopheles' speed is his weakness," Brando said with certainty. "Even if it's not enough to shake him off, it's more than enough to lure him away." "Are you sure?" The knight was slightly surprised. Brando thought to himself that if he was not sure, he would not have been able to complete the Iron Body quest in the past. He nodded. "Listen to me, Lady Orthless. Go west from here and lure him to a place." Orthless hesitated for a moment, then nodded. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.cheedian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.